Chapter 41, Dangerous Visit 4. Everything appeared black. Guard Go-chan felt no sensation in his body, and he realized that everything around him was empty and he couldn't feel any of his five senses. Am I dead after all? He thought his life was truly pathetic. He was an orphan who didn't even know who his parents were, and he had lived half his life as an assassin after being taken in by an assassination organization. Just when he finally retired and tried to live like a human being, everything became twisted because of one damn imposter. Everything felt unjust, and he could only lament. Where am I going? He was curious at times about what happens when you die. But then a familiar voice reached his ears. With meager words and numbers, success lies in the timing. Today's alcoholic offering enters the profound realm, communicating with and receiving the spirits I rely on, the spirits I seek. Weighing and pouring the ceremonial fruit, I bear the shadow of regret as I carry the sacred fragrance within me. Ha! Even in death, he could hear this voice. It was the voice of that imposter. Am I suffering even in death? Having lived as an assassin, he never thought he would go to paradise, but hearing this voice even after death made him depressed. However, the voice continued. The third invocation, a leisurely return and surrender. 8 pecks and 8 flavors, fresh and new. Choose wisely, devote yourself to the knowledge of the spirit's desires. As soon as those words ended, Go-chan felt himself being pulled by some strong, unknown force, and the sensations that had disappeared were faintly replaced by something else. Along with it, the blackness in his vision brightened. Go-chan blinked his eyes. He saw Mok Jong-un forming some strange hand seal in front of him. What was this? Wasn't he dead? While he was puzzled, he noticed a captivating woman with a dumbfounded expression beside Mok Jong-un, Hyuk. It was none other than Ha Ki-rin. What on earth was this situation? Why were the two of them looking at him like this? As he was wondering, Ha Ki-rin opened her mouth. Did it work? Yes, it seems to have succeeded. The half-6/8 spirit summoning technique. Half-6/8 spirit summoning technique. What did that mean? The half-6/8 spirit summoning technique. It is a type of sorcery that utilizes the 8-person talisman to control ghosts. Not knowing this, Go-chan had no idea what the two were talking about. At that moment, Mok Jong-un lowered his hands from the seal and said, Go-chan, let me apologize first. What? Go-chan was momentarily startled. His voice didn't sound like his own, but rather some strange, different form. Then, Mok Jong-un shrugged and said, Reviving you was impossible from the start, so I tried to turn you into a corpse ghost using the 6-person spirit summoning technique, but it seems that failed because my death energy is still insufficient. Yo, young master, what in the world are you talking about? And why does my voice sound like this? Go-chan was stunned for a moment as he looked at his body. He looked at his palm, but why did it appear so hazy? He could see through his palm to the other side. He had no idea what this phenomenon was. Hey, you fool. Your soul's rank has fallen, so it appears even more hazy. Don't make a fuss. Ha Ki-rin said to him. What? At this, Go-chan frowned as he looked at her. This bitch had tried to kill Mok Jong-un by piercing through his heart, and now she was acting as if they were acquainted. As if sensing this thought, Mok Jong-un said, Guard Go-chan, this isn't the assassin from the Baisal sect that you knew. What? What do you mean by that? Chun-gryong has taken over her body. Go-chan couldn't help but be confused by the incomprehensible words. Why was his body like this, and what on earth was Mok Jong-un talking about? To the bewildered Go-chan, Mok Jong-un scratched his head and said, Guard Go-chan, I think I need to tell you this. What is it, young master? You're dead. What? I'm saying Guard Go-chan is dead. Do you mean by that? I am currently? Suddenly, Go-chan's expression stiffened. Come to think of it, it was strange that his voice sounded eerie and that he appeared translucent, so he went to a place where there was a mirror to look around. Go-chan was at a loss for words. His reflection did not appear in the mirror. Young master, am I really dead? Yes. Go-chan was speechless. He felt a mixture of emotions and a sudden surge of grief. He had held on to a faint hope, the hope that he might not be dead. Seeing him like this, Mok Jong-un offered condolences that were not quite comforting in a dry voice. May you rest in peace. Are you mocking me right now? Are you playing with me? Go-chan couldn't hold back his anger anymore, beyond the surge of emotions. Now that he was dead anyway, he was sick and tired of being mindful of this fellow, and there was no reason to do so anymore. If you hadn't killed Master Gam, none of this would have happened, you damn bastard. Curses poured out of him. Seeing him like this, Chung-gryong, who had taken over Ha Ki-rin's body, laughed. She had expected him to be this angry to some extent. In fact, without considerable anger or obsession, souls usually ascend rather than becoming vengeful spirits. But it was Mok Jong-un who had forcibly held onto him and turned him into this state. His rank has fallen too. In terms of rank, Go-chan was the lowest grade spirit. He was no more than a street-level spirit that could be seen only very rarely. Damn bastard. You son of a bitch. Bastard. Die, die. I curse you even in death. No, I'm already dead. Anyway, I curse you, you imposter. From the 4th generation to the 5th generation, misfortune. Phew, shut up. Mok Jong-un said with a sigh. At that moment, something strange happened. MMPH, MMPH, MMPH. Go-chan couldn't open his mouth as Mok Jong-un commanded. He wanted to curse, but the words wouldn't come out regardless of his will. Why was this happening? To the puzzled Go-chan, Mok Jong-un said with a smile. Although you're dead, Guard Go-chan has become my servant spirit through the half-6/8 spirit summoning technique. What did that mean again? You're curious about what a servant spirit is, right? To put it simply, a slave ghost. Yes, you can think of it that way. A slave ghost? Ha! Do you want to die, you fool? Chung-gryong glared at Mok Jong-un and raised her voice. At this, Mok Jong-un waved his hand lightly and corrected himself. Let's just say he's a ghost who has to cooperate with me. Ah, you can't speak. If I let you, will you keep cursing? Go-chan shook his head vigorously. How obedient. Then you can speak again. Ah. At Mok Jong-un's command, his voice returned. At this, Go-chan was momentarily confused about how to accept this situation. He had thought that now that he was dead, he wouldn't be swayed by this fellow anymore, so he had cursed to his heart's content. But even in death, he had to follow this fellow's orders. Damn it! Curses naturally came to his mind. Of course, they didn't come out of his mouth. Now that he knew Mok Jong-un could control him with a single word, he became afraid of this fellow. What the hell is he? He had witnessed strange scenes several times, but he never imagined that he would possess such unbelievable abilities. The power to make even the dead submit to him was absurd. To such Go-chan, Mok Jong-un said, Anyway, Guard Go-chan, I'm glad we can continue to be together. Glad. Did he think he would be happy to be ordered around by him even in death? It was not only disheartening, but also distressing. You don't like it? It seems you don't like it. Then should I just let you go? At those words, Go-chan looked at him with a gleam in his eyes. He thought he would be used even in death, but was he really going to let him go? As he was feeling hopeful, Mok Jong-un glanced at Chung-gryong and said, I don't know the technique to release a servant spirit yet. Is there any other way to release him? If I knew that, would I be in this state? I see. Or if he desires it so much, you can forcibly exorcise him. At those words, Go-chan asked in puzzlement, what is exorcism? It means forcibly banishing a spirit, you fool. Banish. Then does that mean I'll die? That's right. I'm already dead, though. If you die further from there, you'll be annihilated. Does that mean I'll completely disappear? Yes, you'll completely vanish from this world. Who knows, there might be something else, but I don't know since I haven't experienced it myself. At these words, Go-chan's face stiffened. He thought if Mok Jong-un released him, he would go to a place like the afterlife. But from what they were saying now, it sounded like they would kill his soul. Suddenly, Go-chan became afraid. Even now that he was dead and had become a spirit, it was terrifying, and the concept of completely disappearing evoked immense fear. Was that why? Yo, young master? Go-chan knelt down in front of Mok Jong-un. Then, lowering his head, he pleaded, I misspoke. Having just died and being confused about what was happening, I was rude to you, young master. Didn't you say you didn't want to be with me? No, I absolutely want to be with you, young master. Not wanting to be with you, that's an absurd thing to say. Although I have died like this, now that I have another chance to be with you, I will serve you with utmost loyalty. It was a quick change of attitude. Even though he was dead, Go-chan feared further changes here. Seeing his appearance, Chun-Gryong clicked her tongue. T-tuck. Then Chun-Gryong frowned. Noticing her expression, Mok Jeong-un asked, "Is it as expected?" At that question, Chun-Gryong muttered in an irritated voice, "This one can't endure it either. I thought it would be a bit better, but it's a useless wench." At those words, Go-chan looked at her in puzzlement. That expression and way of speaking were completely different from Ha Ki-rin's. What was going on? T-tuck, T-tuck. At that moment, black blood vessels bulged out from the neck of Ha Ki-rin, who was expressing anger. Then Chun-Gryong, who was inside Ha Ki-rin's body, let out a deep sigh and SSSSS. She emerged from that body. Thud. Ha Ki-rin's body collapsed on the ground like a corpse. At that moment, Go-chan froze like an ice sculpture. He wondered what it was, but Chun-Gryong, who had emerged from Ha Ki-rin's body, was truly a shock in itself. What is this? Among spirits, their ranks can be clearly distinguished. Just as humans have 5 senses, spirits have their own alternative senses. Those senses were warning Go-chan that this was a monster beyond imagination. It was as if the surroundings were dyed in blood, walls were collapsing, and even the ground was splitting apart in an illusion. This was definitely not an ordinary spirit. At that moment, Chun-Gryong raised an eyebrow and said to Go-chan, "Won't you lower your gaze?" At those words, Go-chan trembled and slowly lowered his head. Then Chun-Gryong snorted and said, "A newbie spirit whose body is still warm from just dying dares to stare at me. I apologize." Go-chan felt disheartened once again. He thought that everyone would be the same in death, but that wasn't the case. Even in death, there was still a gap in power in that world, and he was no different from the weak. While this was happening, Mok Jeong-un said, "What a shame. I thought it was a quite suitable body. I didn't have high expectations." "Is that so?" He clearly remembered her being very pleased. Where else could he find the body of a young woman who had reached the pinnacle of transcendent realm? He thought this level would be able to handle Chun-Gryong, but in just a few moments, the body couldn't endure it and cracked like the servant ghosts. "I guess there's no choice. It's a pity, but this body, what's there to pity? We can just use it." "Pardon. The rank has fallen anyway, so it won't be of much use in the spirit state. We can give it to this fellow." At those words, Mok Jeong-un looked at Go-chan with interest. Go-chan tilted his head with an anxious expression, wondering what they were talking about. Why me all of a sudden? Then Chun-Gryong suddenly approached Go-chan. SSSK, feeling fear from the overwhelming pressure, Go-chan instinctively tried to back away, but Chun-Gryong grabbed his neck as if hooking him and pushed him somewhere. "Why are you doing this? Stop blabbering and go in. It's rare for a newbie to have this opportunity." Pack. It was Ha Ki-rin's body lying on the ground like a dead person. "Oh, SSSSSK?" At that moment, Go-chan's spirit was forcibly pushed into Ha Ki-rin's body by Chun-Gryong against his will. Ha Ki-rin's body, which was lying on the ground, squirmed and moved wildly. Looking down at this with his arms crossed, Mok Jeong-un said indifferently, "Is it all right?" "Don't know. I've cleared out the ego, so even if the rank has fallen, it should be able to take control quickly." "Is that so? But," he wondered if it was really all right. While this was happening, Ha Ki-rin, who had been convulsing as if in agony by herself, suddenly sat up and spoke with a bewildered look in her eyes. All of a sudden, Hugh, what is this?" She couldn't hide her bewilderment at her own voice. After being startled like that, she lowered her head to look at her chest and was even more shocked. What on earth is this?" No matter how you looked at it, it was a woman's body. Mok Jeong-un shrugged and said to him as if there was no other choice, "Yes, it seems you'll have to work with that body from now on." Chapter 42, Manor Master 1. A man in navy blue martial arts robes, carrying a writing case on his back, paced back and forth not far from the Yon Mok Sword Manor's clan residence, clutching a talisman in his hand. Flutter, flutter. Before long, a large, flapping shadow appeared, centered around where he stood. Gradually, as if descending, the shadow diminished in size. "Gojo, have you found him?" the man asked. In response, the shrunken eagle shadow shook its head. Perplexed, the man's expression shifted to one of incomprehension. He then pointed his sword finger mudra towards a specific spot in the void. Closing his eyes, he immersed himself in deep concentration. After a while, he opened his eyes, furrowing his brow. What's this? Having received what Gojo had witnessed, the man struggled to make sense of the situation. The entire clan residence seemed shrouded in a hazy mist. Such a phenomenon does not occur easily. It can be considered a type of ghostly domain, manifested by the powerful intent of a high-level vengeful spirit. This is no ordinary matter. In terms of magical techniques, a ghostly domain is akin to a barrier. Only vengeful spirits of at least the green spirit level and above are capable of forming such a domain. This was the reason for the man's grave concern. How do I deal with this? He had intended to observe the target from the outside, but that had become difficult. Even Diviner Sack, whose mastery of magical arts nearly rivaled his own, had fallen victim to it, making it impossible to recklessly approach using spells. However, the ghostly spirit pavilion had incurred the madam's wrath, rendering the prospect of entering equally daunting. As he pondered, his gaze fell upon a tipsy youth, arm in arm with women who appeared to be courtesans, stumbling along the path. The youth swayed and collapsed to the ground, vomiting as the courtesans attempted to rouse him. "Oh my! Young Master Mock, young Master Mock. You should go home and rest. Didn't you promise to show us around?" MMM. The courtesans, referred to as young Master Mock, shook him several times to wake him. When he failed to regain consciousness, they furtively glanced around. Seeing that young Master Mock remained unresponsive, they discreetly began rummaging through his pockets. Observing this, the corners of the man's mouth curled up slightly. The basic writings of the school of Yin and Yang state that the lowest rank of vengeful spirits. The red spirits are a type of earthbound spirits that can cause the living to experience goosebumps or mild chills. Go-chan had become a vengeful spirit due to his unwavering desire to live, his sense of injustice, and the death energy infused by Mok Jong-un. Moreover, he was a red spirit, the lowest rank. As a newly formed vengeful spirit, he knew nothing and had no clear understanding of possession or how to carry it out. Thanks to Chengryong's advice, he managed to gradually take control of Ha Qirin's body. As he suppressed her consciousness, fragments of memories seeped in. A blood-stained room, a heart filled with resentment. "Grandfather, you can't be dead, right? Grandfather, you're one of the 4 great assassins of the Central Plains, the flying, killing Yama's guest. Get up. You can't die. Get up. The position of sect leader is vacant, and you want me to complete the 100 days and nights. What kind of nonsense is that? Just do it. Do it. Grandfather, I will definitely inherit your position and avenge you, no matter who it is." Through absorbing Ha Qirin's memories, Go-chan learned that the sect leader had been suddenly murdered, plunging the flying killing sect into internal chaos. Ha Qirin had been undergoing the 100 days and nights ritual to become the next sect leader of the flying killing sect. Was that so? It was a truly astonishing revelation. The deceased sect leader, who had earned the title of one of the 4 great assassins, was a supreme master who had reached the pinnacle of the transformation realm and boasted an almost perfect success rate in assassinations, befitting his status at the pinnacle of the assassin world. Yet such an exceptional assassin had been unexpectedly killed. Based on Ha Qirin's memories, even his granddaughter suspected that it might have been the work of one of the other 4 great assassins. If that were the case, it would pose significant challenges for the flying killing sect's pursuit of revenge. Of course, that was their problem. Go-chan desperately wanted to resolve this issue. "Sir, yes, please remove me from this body." Shudder. Even as he spoke, goosebumps rose on his skin and his arms tingled. It was because of his own voice. Anyone can imagine being the opposite sex, but when it actually happens, it becomes overwhelming for Go-chan. "If I remove you, I'll have to deal with that woman immediately." Ugh. She was an assassin who had targeted Mok Jong-un's life. He couldn't let her live. "That woman is the granddaughter of the flying killing sect's manor master, right? Didn't you say she's the next sect leader?" "Well, yes, but..." I came here because of the now-dead guard Gam, but if his granddaughter dies, things will get even more troublesome, don't you think? That's true. Go Chan's voice trailed off. He couldn't deny Mok Jong-un's words. Although the disciples of the Flying Killing sect found her temperament challenging, their loyalty and respect for the deceased Flying Killing Yama's guest were exceptionally high. Therefore, if his granddaughter Ha Ki-rin were to die, the entire Flying Killing sect would resort to every means possible to kill Mok Jong-un. In fact, he secretly hoped for it. I wish he would die. However, if Mok Jong-un died, Go Chan would also perish. That was the fate of a spirit with a connected bond, as Chen Griong had explained. Damn it, it was a cruel twist of fate. He was essentially no different from a slave. He couldn't allow Mok Jong-un to die even if he wanted to. Go Chan found himself in a conflicted state of mind. Sigh. Chen Griong, who had been smoking a long pipe and exhaling smoke, clicked her tongue and spoke to the troubled Go Chan. Why do you look like you're about to die? Newbie, you should be grateful just for possessing a living body. Is this something to be grateful for? If that's the case, couldn't she have put him in a male body? However, fearing Chen Griong, he uttered words that contradicted his true feelings. Well, that's true, but you were a weakling when you were alive, weren't you? To be merely second-rate at that age, even after retiring as an assassin, means there was almost no hope for you. It was like a fatal blow, one might say. Every word Chen Griong spoke was like a sharp dagger, tormenting Go Chan. It rendered him speechless in a different sense. Pack. At that moment, Go Chan instinctively tilted his head back slightly. Yo, young master. Right in front of his nose, he saw the sole of Mok Jong-un's shoe. If he had been a moment later, he would have been kicked in the chin. Mok Jong-un then said to him, You're definitely fast. Even faster than when you were alive. What? Go Chan frowned at those words. Upon reflection, he realized that this movement was not his own. He had followed the lead of the body. The body of Ha Ki-rin, who had reached the pinnacle of the transcendent realm, possessed a level of intuition that was incomparably more acute than Go Chan, who had merely been second-rate. Seeing his realization, Chen Griong chuckled and spoke. Why are you so surprised? It's only natural since you've possessed a strong body. Is that so? Still, it's best if you adapt to it. Newbie, given your low level, it will take more time for you to fully utilize that body. Even among vengeful spirits, there exist different ranks. Chen Griong, who had ascended to the realm of the two demons and two spirits one, could draw out power surpassing the original body when possessing someone. However, Go Chan, who was merely at the lowest red spirit level, was incapable of such feats. Nonetheless, possessing the body of a supreme master at the pinnacle of the transcendent realm meant he had become incomparably stronger than his original self. Transcendent realm. Go Chan felt a strange sensation. When he had been alive and cultivating martial arts, his goal had been to reach the first-rate level. However, despite his ardent desire, his talent was lacking, and he ultimately failed to cross that threshold. Now he found himself in possession of a body that had reached the pinnacle of the transcendent realm. Realizing this, his feelings took a distinct turn. You seem to be pleased now, I see. At Chen Griong's remark, Go Chan regained his senses and waved his hands in denial. Although he was captivated by the prospect of being at the transcendent realm, the fact that it was a woman's body and not a man's continued to torment him. Being a newbie, your thinking is still mundane. Chen Griong clicked her tongue. Once one accepts the reality of their own death and the concept of being a spirit, the physical body becomes nothing more than a shell. Of course, there is a difference between a shell one likes and one that one doesn't, but still. She found it incomprehensible that he would show such aversion simply because it was a woman's body. Tusk, you should be satisfied that you've obtained a young and beautiful body. I am a man. Even if being young is good, a woman's body is simply. If you dare to indulge in self-gratification while secretly admiring yourself in the mirror when no one's looking, I will kill you. No, why would I do such a thing? He had no such inclinations. If he had to possess a body, he would have preferred a male one. Mok Jong-un then said to him, For now, please adapt to that body. When an opportunity arises later, I will arrange for you to transfer to another one. He wanted to demand an immediate change, but recognizing the situation, Go Chan could say no more. He could only nod his head in dejection. It seemed he had no choice but to live as Ha Kirin for the time being. But would this fellow really allow him to switch bodies so easily? He felt a strange unease. At that moment, thump, 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 the sound of someone running down the corridor could be heard. Then someone knocked on the door. Knock, knock. Who is it? Young master, it's Baekhyun from the inner hall. Come in. At Mok Jong-un's words, the door opened, and a man dressed in the attire of the inner hall entered. The man named Baekhyun slightly bowed his head in a simple greeting, then spoke in a voice filled with delight. Young master, rejoice. What? Why was he suddenly being told to rejoice? As he wondered, the inner hall guard Baekhyun said, "The manor master has awakened." Those words brought a glint to the eyes of both Mok Jong-un and Go Chan, who was possessing Ha Kirin's body. At the time, the manor master had not been possessed, but was on the verge of death due to the demonic master's killed Chinese letter. Although Mok Jong-un had left the body, the manor master had been significantly weakened, yet somehow he seemed to have survived. This was an unexpected development. Mok Jong-un had been contemplating leaving this place once he had become somewhat familiar with the basic techniques before the manor master succumbed to his injuries. Staying longer would only lead to unpleasant entanglements with the madam or the second young master. But now the manor master had awakened. Does that mean he had fully recovered? Young master? At the call of the inner hall guard Baekhyun, Mok Jong-un changed his expression and placed his hand on his chest, speaking in a tone of relief. Ah, what a relief, to hear that father has awakened. Seeing his act, Go Chan inwardly clicked his tongue. Of course, the inner hall guard Baekhyun, unaware of Mok Jong-un's true nature, harbored no suspicions. It's a blessing for the Yon Mok Sword Manor clan. Indeed, thank you for coming to inform me. Ah, that's not the only reason. What? The manor master is looking for you, young master. For me? Yes, he said to bring you immediately. Mok Jong-un slightly tilted his head at those words. The manor master had summoned him as soon as he woke up. Why? Could it be because of that hidden place beneath the medicinal hall? Ah, at Chingryong's words, Mok Jong-un inwardly acknowledged the possibility. Perhaps the manor master had already checked the place where the secret manuals were hidden after waking up. If that were the case, Mok Jong-un would naturally be the object of suspicion. What will you do? In response to that question, Mok Jong-un lightly shrugged his shoulders. Currently, the inner hall guard had personally come to escort him, so he had no choice but to go. Judging solely from the delighted reaction of the inner hall guard, it was still uncertain whether the manor master had summoned him for the reason Chingryong had speculated. I understand. I will head to the main hall shortly. No, he said to bring you immediately. Immediately. Maybe not. Hearing it put this way, it became difficult to ascertain once again. Regardless, it seemed the encounter with the manor master could not be delayed. Understood. Then let us go. At Mok Jong-un's words, Go Chan, who was possessing Ha Kirin's body, habitually prepared to follow. However, Mok Jong-un shook his head and said, Guard, go. Kirin, don't you have some cleaning to do in the storage room? Go Kirin, he said. The names were mixed up. Feeling somewhat cringed, Go Chan frowned. Suddenly, he recalled what had happened in the storage room. It was the place where he had lost his life. Had they not disposed of his corpse yet? I'll be back soon. In the meantime, please take care of the cleaning. Understood. As Go Chan responded, Mok Jong-un left the room, following the inner hall guard Baekhyun. Chingryong naturally accompanied Mok Jong-un. After their departure, Go Chan felt a sense of unease. He now found himself in a situation where he had to handle the disposal of his own corpse. Damn it! Go Chan shook his head in disbelief. Nevertheless, he soon rose from his seat to head to the storage room. For a moment, Go Chan blushed as he looked down at his chest. The unfamiliar weight and sensation he had never experienced as a man left him feeling strange. Goosebumps rose involuntarily. He gazed into the mirror but couldn't adapt. Ha Kirin's alluring face and fluttering clothes remained unchanged, and she was undeniably beautiful. Perhaps because she had grown so splendidly, it's more bothersome than I thought. His chest felt somewhat heavy. Go-chan furtively glanced around to ensure no one was nearby, then, driven by curiosity, unknowingly brought both hands gently to his chest. Swish! At that instant, Chengryong's face abruptly appeared, penetrating through the door screen. Go-chan instantly froze like ice. Tusk, tusk. Seeing this, Chengryong clicked her tongue as if finding it pathetic, then promptly withdrew her face. Swish! He hastily opened the door and looked outside, but she had long vanished. Go-chan felt the urge to dig a grave and bury himself right then and there. A glint of interest flashed in Mok Jong-un's eyes as he headed towards the main hall. It was because he wasn't the only one heading there. On a forked path, Mok Yuchen, whose complexion had turned somewhat dark red compared to 4 days ago, was walking under the guidance of another inner hall guard. Could it be unrelated to the medicinal hall incident? Should he consider it fortunate? As he pondered, Mok Yuchen, who had spotted Mok Jong-un, approached with quick strides as if he had something to say. Chapter 43, Manner Master 2. Mok Yuchen approached with quick strides as if he had something to say. However, upon reaching Mok Jong-un, he seemed unable to speak his mind directly, perhaps due to the presence of the 2 inner hall guards who had come to escort them. In response, Mok Jong-un smiled and spoke first. It's been 4 days. Don't make idle talk. You. Mok Yuchen stammered, unable to complete his sentence. What could be the reason for his behavior? As Mok Jong-un wondered, Mok Yuchen gestured with his head, indicating that they should head to the main hall for now. Thus, they walked towards the main hall. When the inner hall guards took the lead, walking ahead with a sense of discretion, Mok Yuchen spoke in a quiet voice. Have you tried that thing? That thing? Keep your voice down. Mok Yuchen admonished softly. Mok Jong-un chuckled and replied in a low voice. What are you talking about? Are you really asking because you don't know? Perhaps the ignited wood. SHH. Mok Yuchen cut off Mok Jong-un's words. Glancing at the inner hall guards walking ahead of them, Mok Yuchen whispered even more quietly. Don't mention it directly. Just answer my question. What Mok Yuchen was inquiring about was none other than the Manor Master's exclusive secret manual, the Ignited Wood Heart Transformation Method. In fact, upon noticing that Mok Yuchen's complexion had turned significantly darker compared to 4 days ago, Mok Jong-un immediately understood what he was referring to. However, he feigned ignorance. It's impressive that you haven't succumbed to delusion yet. Who? Chengryong, who was beside them, remarked while puffing on her pipe. She, too, was aware that Mok Yuchen had learned the wrong cultivation method. Since Mok Jong-un had not provided the complete method and had arbitrarily changed some characters in the oral formula, side effects were inevitable. Is there a problem? Although it was intentional, Mok Jong-un spoke as if he knew nothing. Mok Yuchen's brow furrowed fiercely. You're saying that even after looking at my face? His voice rose, but as he glanced ahead, Mok Yuchen cut off his words. He seemed to be suppressing his anger. After managing to compose himself, Mok Yuchen spoke quietly. Did you try it or not? Just tell me that. In response to that question, Mok Jong-un answered nonchalantly. If it were you, wouldn't you have tried it? At those words, Mok Yuchen narrowed his eyes and stared intently at Mok Jong-un. Right, there's no way you wouldn't have tried it. Even if he had claimed not to covet the position of Manor Master, it was a secret manual of the supreme martial arts. Any martial artist would have been curious. But why are you unaffected? For the past 4 days, Mok Yuchen had practiced the breathing technique of the Ignited Wood Heart Transformation Method with overflowing enthusiasm. However, the more he practiced, the more he felt the internal energy within his body transforming and becoming strangely different. On the first day, he had dismissed it as a possible effect of the supreme martial arts cultivation method, but after 4 days his skin had turned dark red, and something felt amiss. Did he deceive me? Due to the changes occurring in his body, his suspicions wouldn't easily subside. It was difficult to confront Mok Jong-un. as he had readily recited the oral formula 9 times upon request, making it ambiguous to accuse him of providing a fake one. If that fellow taught me the genuine method, then it means I'm the problem. That in itself was hard for him to accept. Even he, who had reached the pinnacle of the peak realm, was struggling to master the cultivation method. Yet this fellow showed no signs of the same side effects as him. If that were the case, it would imply that he might have misunderstood or incorrectly practiced the oral formula of the cultivation method. Clench. Mok Yuchen's fist tightened. No, that couldn't be. How could this fellow, who was merely third-rate due to his lacking talent, surpass him, the one hailed as a genius in his understanding of the supreme martial arts? He didn't know what the problem was, but he was determined to overcome it. At that moment, Mok Jong-un said to Mok Yuchen, "I'm not sure what the issue is, but now that the Manor Master has awakened, won't the situation change?" This time, the corners of Mok Yuchen's mouth curled up slightly. Indeed, the Manor Master's awakening was a stroke of fortune for him. He had begun learning the Manor Master's exclusive martial arts through a deal, but many of the clan's vassals still viewed him, the son of a concubine, with distrust. Thus, he had felt a great sense of unease. However, now that the Manor Master, who cherished him, had awakened, the succession structure had once again turned in his favor. The heavens are on my side. Perhaps the Manor Master summoning his children immediately after waking up was related to this matter as well. To clearly designate his successor, seeing Mok Yuchen's expectant demeanor, Mok Jong-un chuckled and turned his gaze away as if disinterested. Ho-ho. At that moment, Chen Griong looked somewhere with intrigue. Mok Jong-un glanced at her questioningly. She then spoke. "It seems they have entered. Entered, they have quite the guts, to set foot inside my ghostly domain without fear, even after seeing it." Ah, at her words, Mok Jong-un nodded in understanding. It seemed that what he had been waiting for had arrived. Mok Jong-un had anticipated that Diviner Sack's associates would undoubtedly come before long. "I shall greet them first." Swish. With those words, Chen Griong, whose red eyes gleamed, vanished beyond the wall beside the path, in front of the main hall. Another bloodline of the Mok family had already arrived. It was Mok Yong-ho, the eldest young master. Although he had circulated his internal energy to alleviate his hangover to some extent, he still reeked of alcohol, causing Lady Siok's expression to sour. His debauchery was nothing new, so despite her frustration, she had grown somewhat accustomed to it. However, today was different. Why now, of all times? She was already plagued with worries due to the variable named Mok Jong-un. But this variable could be resolved by either eliminating Mok Jong-un or seizing the Manor Master's exclusive secret manual from him, so she was contemplating alternative solutions. Yet, the Manor Master, whom she had assumed would surely breathe his last, had awakened. Rather than joy at her husband's awakening, she was gripped by unease. Could it be, why had he summoned his children first thing after waking up? No matter how much she pondered, only one thought crossed her mind. Successor. Perhaps the Manor Master, having barely regained consciousness after a long coma, intended to designate his successor in preparation for any unforeseen circumstances. If her speculation were correct, it would be disastrous. It was a well-known fact that the Manor Master had favored the youngest, Mok Yuchen. If Yong-ho were to enter in such a state at this juncture, grit. Even though he was her own child at times like this, he was truly a nuisance. Just 2 years ago, he had been sensible enough to be called clever, if not a genius, but at some point, he had become immersed in wine and women. All of this was because of that Mok Yuchen. However, now was not the time to loathe or resent him. Yong-ho. Yes, mother. Refrain from making unnecessary remarks in front of the Manor Master. This mother will handle everything, so you just stay quiet. Opening his mouth while reeking of alcohol would do no good. Although this meeting was only for the children, she believed they wouldn't prevent her, as the wife, from entering. If the Manor Master intended to confirm the succession immediately, she had to find a way to stop it. As she pondered, she noticed Lady Jiang and the second son of the Mok family, Mok Yunpyong, approaching from the entrance of the left pavilion. HMPH. They were also detestable. Lady Jiang, who hailed from the Huanan family, acted subserviently in front of her, addressing her as sister-in-law. But behind her back, she resorted to all sorts of schemes to elevate her own son to the position of manor master, such as winning over the clan's vassals. Despicable creature, that Mok Yunpyong was no different. Like mother, like son, he was a thief coveting the position of the eldest son, Mok Yongho. Although she wasn't certain what the manor master would say today, their desires would not come to fruition. She would make sure of it. As she ruminated, the last of the Mok family's young masters arrived at the entrance of the southern pavilion. It was the third son, Mok Jeong-un, and the youngest, Mok Yuchen. Seeing this, the inner manor master, Jang Myung-in, ascended the wooden floor and announced through the door screen, "All the young masters have gathered." The 4 half-brothers of the Mok family stood side by side. From left to right, there was the eldest young master Mok Yongho, the second son Mok Yunpyong, the third son Mok Jeong-un, and the youngest Mok Yuchen. Only these 4 had entered the manor master's room. Lady Siak, the first wife, and Lady Jiang, the second wife, had insisted on entering as well, but they were unable to do so due to the manor master's adamants. They were waiting outside, fidgeting anxiously. Mok Jeong-un was inwardly perplexed. The reason was the reactions of the Mok family brothers. He had expected them to show joy and warmth, welcoming the manor master who had narrowly escaped death's doorstep, as he was their father. However, surprisingly, they appeared utterly tense. Even Mok Yuchen, who was said to be so cherished, was no exception. As a result, the atmosphere was quite heavy. So that's why. Now he understood. He realized why they had been so concerned about the manor master's life and death while he was bedridden. It turned out they were gauging the manor master's mood. How strict must he be for them to display such nervousness? Mok Jeong-un surreptitiously glanced at the face of the manor master, who was half sitting on the bed. Despite being unconscious for a long time due to the killing, curse, Chinese letter, his eyes were so sharp that they felt alive. Wasn't it said that he's the strongest in the Yon Mok sword manor? That was indeed written in the information note left by the real Mok Jeong-un. Manor Master Mok Indan. He was said to be the strongest swordsman in the Yon Mok sword manor and one of the top 10 swordsmen in the entire Anhui province. Out of curiosity, he had asked the deceased guard Gam about this. What level does being in the top 10 of a province equate to? Do you think it's an easy feat to become one of the top 10 swordsmen in an entire province, you fool? The guard Gam had said that Manor Master Mok Indan was a martial artist who had reached the pinnacle of the transcendent realm. At the time, he hadn't fully grasped the magnificence of that level. However, after experiencing the strength of the youngest Mok Yuchen, who had reached the early stage of the peak realm, he could now somewhat fathom how powerful a master of that caliber would be. But that also raised a question. How did he fall victim to the killing curse? A supreme master at the pinnacle of the transcendent realm is said to manipulate energy as naturally as breathing. It was incomprehensible how someone so formidable had succumbed to the kill, a type of curse. As he was studying magical techniques, it puzzled him even more. At that moment, Mok Jeong-un's eyes met those of Manor Master Mok Indan. Unlike the other brothers, Mok Jeong-un did not avert his gaze. He saw no reason to do so, no matter how strict the father-son relationship was. This behavior caught the attention of Manor Master Mok Indan. The reason was simple. This child, who had never properly made eye contact with him since his mother's passing, did not avoid his gaze. However, his bewilderment ended there. Mok Indan spoke. "Do you know why I summoned you all?" Everyone remained silent in response to this question. Of course, they all had one thing in mind: successor. However, they couldn't openly voice it. They had to avoid appearing presumptuous here, but someone broke the silence and spoke up. "Could it be that you summoned us all immediately after waking from your long illness to discuss the matter of your successor?" Everyone looked at the speaker with slightly startled eyes. It was Mok Jeong-un. He's being straightforward. After glancing at Mok Jong-un, they cautiously gauged Manor Master Mok In-dan's reaction. They wanted to check if his mood had turned unpleasant. Surprisingly, Manor Master Mok In-dan showed no sign of discomfort. Rather, yes, it is to designate my successor. He readily admitted it. At this, everyone's expressions grew tense. Until he had awakened from his sick, the Manor Master had never personally mentioned the matter of his successor. Yet he was bringing it up for the first time. Is he going to decide right here and now? Could it be that he gathered us all to pass the successor position to that Mok Yuchen? His father giving me a chance, each of them became lost in thought. Of course, Mok Jong-un had no attachment to the Manor Master's position, so he planned to simply go along with the atmosphere. Perhaps because of this, he appeared the most relaxed among them. However, this demeanor came as a surprise to the Manor Master. Does he have no expectations? Or has he changed? The reaction, which was quite different from the other children, piqued his interest. Coincidentally, the Manor Master had already heard about recent events from the inner Manor Master. That child, Mok Jong-un, saved me. Yes. Initially, even this subordinate found it hard to believe, but the third young master prevented the Fang assassin who was possessed by an evil spirit and tried to harm the Lord. It was quite unexpected. He would have believed it if it had been the youngest, Mok Yuchen. But of all people, it was this child, whom he had considered the most timid and lacking in talent with no prospects, who had saved him. But that is merely the third young master's opinion and the exact truth. That's enough. That much is sufficient. Pardon, summon all the children. You mean the young masters? That's right. The Manor Master had gathered all the young masters less than half a shichen after waking up. For the first time, he thought that the time given to him might not be long. Lying on his sick for an extended period, he had expended a significant amount of his true energy, and this incident had nearly caused him to close his eyes forever. If that had happened, the Yon Mok Sword Manor would have been plunged into chaos and war among his children. Even without experiencing it, that future was clear to him. Thus, he made a decision. I will determine who is qualified to be my successor through a test. As he spoke those words, the Manor Master subtly glanced at Mok Jong-un. I shall grant even you a modicum of opportunity. Chapter 43.5, The Manor Master 3. From the hill below, the lights of the manor were visible. Two figures stood in the darkness, gazing at the scene with indifferent eyes. The taller of the two asked the other, Is this the place? Yes. Upon hearing the response, the tall figure retrieved something the size of a finger from within his robes. It appeared to be a seal of some sort. I heard the owner of this was released from the duty of killing. What was the reason? The figure beside him, forming a hand seal with one hand, replied with a smirk, The demonic eagle. What's that? The demonic puppet of Mt. Nako. Demonic puppet? I've heard stories of a diviner in the nearby pavilion who uses the monstrous demonic eagle as his divine beast. It seems that person is here. The tall figure's eyes flashed with interest at those words. I see, so there was a diviner's intervention. Now that we have the answer, what should we do? We must bring it. With those words, the tall figure raised his hand. At that moment, countless sounds of movement could be heard from behind. I will determine who is qualified to be the clan's successor through a test. The atmosphere in the room shifted drastically at the Manor Master's declaration. The youngest, Mok Yuchen, couldn't hide his joy, his lips twitching at the Manor Master's words. After all, if it was a test, he would be at an advantage over anyone else. Ah, father is giving me a chance. What would a test in a martial clan entail? Naturally, it would showcase one's martial arts prowess. The eldest son, Mok Yongho, was at the second-rate level, the second son, Mok Yunpyong, was first-rate, and the third son beside him, Mok Jong-un, was merely third-rate. No one could defeat him. Whether it was a martial arts competition or anything else, he had the upper hand. Nash, the second son, Mok Yunpyong, bit his lower lip tightly. He, too, had thoughts similar to Mok Yuchen. No matter who heard it, the Manor Master's declaration was undoubtedly in favor of the youngest, Mok Yuchen, who possessed the most outstanding martial arts skills. If it was based on martial arts, who could defeat that monstrous kid who had reached the initial stage of the peak realm at the mere age of 16. How could you do this? It would have been better to appoint Mok Yuchen directly if it was going to be like this. Mok Yun-pyong, who found all of this unfair, mustered up the courage to open his mouth, something he wouldn't have dared to do under normal circumstances. I have something to say to you, father. What is it? If it's a test, what exactly will we be doing? At that question, Manor Master Mok In-dan stared intently at his second son, Mok Yun-pyong. Under his father's imposing gaze, Mok Yun-pyong, who had barely gathered the courage to speak up, lowered his head slightly, averting his eyes. Mok In-dan let out a small snort. To muster up an opinion only to be unable to even meet his father's gaze. It was pathetic beyond compare. However, having narrowly escaped death, he had decided to give everyone a fair chance in the process of selecting the Manor Master. Thus he spoke. If it were a simple matter of testing martial arts through a competition, none of you would be able to defeat the youngest. At those words, Mok Yun-pyong's expression instantly soured. His pride had been wounded. However, in front of his father, he quickly managed his expression. Manor Master Mok In-dan continued speaking without paying any heed. Therefore, I will distinguish who possesses the qualifications to be the Manor Master. Qualifications. The expressions of the Mok family's brothers turned puzzled at those words. Even Mok Yuchen, who had thought that everything would be decided through martial arts since it was a matter of selecting the successor of a martial clan, felt uneasy when qualifications were mentioned. If those qualifications weren't based on martial arts, it would be the most disadvantageous for him. Perhaps that was why Mok Yun-pyong's expression, in turn, brightened. Just a moment ago, he had thought the Manor Master's intention was set on the youngest, Mok Yuchen. But if qualifications were being discussed, it would be difficult for Mok Yuchen, the son of a concubine, to gain the recognition of the retainers. Then it will be a fight between this guy and me. Mok Yun-pyong glanced at his eldest brother, Mok Yang-ho, beside him. It was impossible to know what he was thinking. The madam was trying to make him the successor by any means, but the person himself was so far off the mark that he only brought disappointment to the Manor Master. There's a chance now. Mok Yun-pyong had been unable to hide his disappointment upon hearing the news of the Manor Master's awakening. However, he was filled with a glimmer of hope. If he played his cards right, he might be able to gain his father's recognition and officially become the Manor Master. At that moment, Mok Yuchen cautiously opened his mouth. Father, may I ask what it means to assess qualifications? The position of Manor Master is that of the leader who guides this single group called the Yon Mok Sword Manor. I will test if someone is suitable for that role. A person suitable to be the Manor Master. It was even more difficult to guess what kind of test it would be. Glancing over his sons, Manor Master Mok In-dan continued, regardless of having different mothers, you are all my children. Therefore, in choosing a successor, everyone will be given a fair chance. So for now, return and contemplate what kind of test there might be and prepare accordingly. Having said what he needed to, he ordered his sons to leave. As they were about to withdraw, bowing their heads with their hands clasped together, I apologize, but I will not take the test. Everyone's attention turned to the one who had spoken. It was none other than Mok Jeong-un. What is he talking about? He won't take the test. Both Mok Yun-pyong and Mok Yuchen looked at him with uncomprehending eyes. Was he voluntarily giving up the official opportunity to become the successor? As they were puzzled, Manor Master Mok In-dan questioned, You won't take the test? That's correct. Why won't you take it? I am lacking in many aspects compared to my elder brothers and even my younger brother. Thus, I believe I am not qualified to be the successor. Therefore, I will not take the test. Upon hearing this, Mok Yun-pyong let out a small snort. Whatever his intentions were, if he was stepping down on his own, there was nothing bad about it. It meant the competition would become even more manageable. Was he really serious? Mok Yuchen found it unexpected. Unlike when the Manor Master's life and death were uncertain, refusing the official opportunity to become the successor meant that what he had told him was true. He hadn't expected him to truly not desire the position of Manor Master. What was he thinking? This is good. Mok Jong-un, on the other hand, was pleased with this situation. If he officially withdrew from the succession struggle, they would no longer bother him. His goal was martial arts anyway. Once he had established a solid foundation, he would leave the Yon Mok sword manor. There was no need to be tied down. However, why do you think you are lacking? The manor master's question continued. Mok Jong-un was puzzled by this kind of question. As far as he knew, the manor master had found the eldest son, Mok Yong-ho, and the deceased Mok Jong-un pathetic. Then there should be no regret in him dropping out of the succession test. He's being troublesome. It would have been over if he had just acknowledged it. But there was no benefit in offending the manor master here, so he had no choice but to provide an appropriate justification. It is said that a successor should prioritize the eldest son, and if not, it is right to appoint someone with outstanding abilities and high merit. Moreover, my maternal family is not what it used to be and cannot be of help to the Yon Mok sword manor, so I am even more unqualified to be the successor. He smoothly explained the reasons why he wasn't suitable. Mok Yunpyong nodded his head at this. He knows his place. He was satisfied. To this extent, he naturally thought the manor master would no longer insist on Mok Jong-un taking the succession test. But something seemed strange. The manor master's expression toward Mok Jong-un wasn't that bad. Rather, it was closer to a look of reconsidering him. What? And that guess was correct. What Mok Jong-un had said was self-deprecating, so it couldn't be called exceptional. However, for the manor master, Mok Jong-un's demeanor of clearly understanding himself and directly expressing his opinion was vastly different from before. That weakness and pathetic appearance were nowhere to be seen. What had happened during the years he had been bedridden with his eyes closed? He has changed. What had transformed this kid like this? Or had he been changing during the few years he hadn't paid attention to him? The manor master became curious about Mok Jong-un. Swish! Suddenly, the manor master swung the outer robe he was wearing to the back, revealing the manor master's upper body, which was covered in numerous scars. Among them, what caught everyone's attention was, his severed arm, clearly visible despite being wrapped in bandages. Everyone knew that he had met with an accident caused by some mysterious assailant a few days ago, but they hadn't known that his arm had been cut off. Manor Master Mok In-dan was a swordsman. For a right-handed swordsman to lose an arm was no different from losing his prime. However, as if he didn't care about it at all, he opened his mouth. You said it yourself. Pardon? That the eldest son or someone with outstanding abilities and merit should be chosen as the successor. Yes, but I am neither of those. I heard you blocked and killed the person who cut off this father's arm. What? At those words, everyone turned to look at Mok Jong-un. They had heard that Mok Jong-un, who had visited the main hall, had been injured and stayed in the medical hall for a while, but they had no idea such a thing had happened. Of course, this fact had been embellished by Mok Jong-un. Mok Jong-un hadn't anticipated that the story he had embellished and shared would lead to such a troublesome outcome. The manor master, pointing to his severed arm, said, According to your words, someone who has made contributions is also fully qualified to be the successor. So it seems that reason alone is not enough to justify refusing the test. At the manor master's words, Mok Jong-un's face became expressionless. It was becoming quite bothersome for the manor master to try to pull him in like this when he had clearly stated he wouldn't take the test. So Mok Jong-un decided it would be better to just say he wouldn't participate in the test. But then something caught Mok Jong-un's eye. It was the scar visible on the manor master's side. The scar, which had healed but was still distinctly visible, seemed to have been caused by a sharp object like a sword. The moment Mok Jong-un saw it, his eyes narrowed. The scar, it was remarkably similar to the mark he had been searching for. Because of this, Mok Jong-un's mind was focused on only one thing, how the manor master had gotten that scar rather than matters of succession or anything else. Flinch. At that moment, Mok Jong-un frowned and slightly turned his head. The manor master asked with a puzzled expression, Why are you doing that? What? Before he could even finish his sentence. Manor Master Mok In-dan also turned sharp-eyed and abruptly rose from his seat. Father! The other brothers of the mock family were bewildered. No sooner had that happened than sudden noises of commotion erupted from outside. "It's an enemy raid. The enemy has infiltrated. Inform the manor master." A sudden emergency situation. Everyone couldn't hide their shock. Meanwhile, the youngest, Mok Yuchen, who had sensed the presences almost simultaneously with the sounds of commotion, looked at Mok Jeong-un with surprised eyes. What's with this guy? He had noticed it even before his father and himself, despite being merely a third-rate martial artist. Chapter 44. Ambush 1. A man in navy blue martial arts robes, with 2 talismans of the 6 armors total symbol 1 on his forehead, chest, and abdomen, and 1 talisman of the thunder god seal symboled Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, continuously chanted spells with a tense expression. The twin brightness presides, the divine position holds authority. Absorbing the yin and embracing the yang, the dull and hidden form, leading the spirits and acting alone, moving swiftly without hindrance. The noble horse possesses majestic power, the heavenly soldiers march forward. Hurry, hurry, in accordance with the law and order. The spell he was reciting was a type of concealment technique called the Western Mantra. The man in navy blue robes, his face drenched in cold sweat, incessantly scanned his surroundings, maintaining vigilance. While chanting the spell, no one could detect his presence. The drawback was that he couldn't move and had to continuously recite the spell without rest. Damn it, he was filled with regret. He had thought that with his experience surpassing even Sack, and his ability to control the high-grade monster level 2 demons and 2 spirits, he could thoroughly uncover the truth as long as he was cautious. However, that had been his miscalculation. How could this happen? It wasn't at the green spirit level. There was absolutely no way that could be the case. If it were a green spirit, he could have somehow confronted it by combining his magical techniques with the power of his spirit servant, Gojo. Yet in an instant, it had unraveled the binding technique he had cast and inflicted wounds upon him. The man's back was soaked in blood. Gojo! The spirit servant Gojo had lured that entity. It was to buy time for him. However, a problem had arisen. Thanks to the admirable spirit servant, he thought he could escape this situation, but he couldn't understand what was happening. Russell, Russell, who were these masked individuals? Thanks to the concealment technique, he could avoid their gazes, but they didn't seem to be the warriors of the Yon Mock Sword Manor. If they were, there would be no reason for them to enter wearing masks in the middle of the night. The dull and hidden form, leading the spirits and acting alone, moving swiftly without hindrance. The noble horse possesses majestic power, the heavenly soldiers march forward. It was a difficult situation. Due to the blood loss from his back, his strength was gradually waning. For some unknown reason, these masked individuals were thoroughly searching every corner of the surroundings, looking for something. He had to endure until they disappeared, but it was extremely challenging. I must endure, somehow, at that moment. What's that? A figure, distinctly different from the masked individuals searching the surroundings, revealed himself. It was a man wearing an eye patch and holding a walking stick. The moment he saw him, the man instinctively knew. A diviner, the extraordinary aura emanating from him. This was one of the characteristics that manifested in those who had cultivated magical techniques for a long time. Even if that weren't the case, the hand seal he had formed with his left hand alone was a fundamental of magical techniques. The art of pursuit. It was a spell used when one wanted to find a desired target. The man furrowed his brow. Seeing how the masked individuals naturally carried on with their task in the presence of the diviner, it was evident that they were all part of the same group. However, there was a crucial rule among diviners. They cultivated the principles of the Tao and practiced magical techniques, so they refrained from directly colluding with or joining any worldly organizations. Until just 10 years ago, this rule had been strictly adhered to. However, it was broken by someone and a group of diviners. Could it be these masked individuals? Swish. Gasp. The man's breathing grew ragged. It was because the man with the eye patch was standing right in front of him. He was using a concealment technique, so it should have been impossible to detect him, but he couldn't understand what was happening. As he was perplexed, the diviner with the eye patch spoke. "If you wanted to use a concealment technique, you should have completely erased your traces." Traces. Ah, the man finally realized. The blood flowing from his back was dripping onto the ground. At that moment, the man with the eye patch chanted a spell and forcefully struck the ground with his walking stick. The spiritual eyes perceive, each possessing clear understanding. Hurry, hurry, in accordance with the law and order, release Chinese letter. Thud, whoosh. Instantly, the space around the walking stick distorted, and along with it, the man's figure, which had been completely hidden from sight, was revealed. Startled, the man leaped backward, attempting to cast another magical technique. However, clap, 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 Lin Chinese letter, Bing Chinese letter, Jai Chinese letter, Zhen Chinese letter. As the hand seals of the 9-character activating method were formed, the man's feet stuck to the ground. At the same time, his body went limp and strength drained from him. The man's eyes widened. To perform a technique of this level with just hand seals, magical techniques are completed through various combinations. Mantra Chinese letter, talisman Chinese letter, word Chinese letter, sealed Chinese letter, instrument Chinese letter. These 5 elements harmonize exquisitely to form a technique Chinese letter. Diviners with low proficiency need to utilize all 4 methods to achieve a technique, but those with higher levels of mastery can reduce them, at least level Moon 2 or above. Diviners receive 6 levels of titles based on their proficiency. From top to bottom, they are Divine Chinese letter, Sun Chinese letter, Moon Chinese letter, Technique Chinese letter, Profound Chinese letter, and Conveying Chinese letter. The man was certain. This man with the eye patch was a diviner with an extraordinary level of mastery in magical techniques, at least at the Fang Yu level or above. The man spoke with extreme tension. "I am Mogo, the diviner assassin of the ghostly spirit pavilion. You are..." Grip. Erg. Before he could finish his sentence, the man with the eye patch grasped the mouth of the ghostly spirit pavilion's diviner assassin, who had identified himself as Mogo, with one hand. Then, curling the corners of his mouth in a sinister manner, he spoke. "How dare you interfere with the actions of our primal killing pavilion? You must have been prepared to die." Primal killing pavilion. Unfortunately, his ominous assumption had been correct. A group of diviners who, despite being members of the 64 diviner sects, had joined a massive martial arts organization. That was none other than the Primal Killing Pavilion 3. Meanwhile, at the same time, clang, clang, clang. The sound of clashing weapons filled the area in front of the main hall. Thud. What is this? The Mach family brothers, led by Manor Master Mach and Dan, emerged from the room, unable to hide their bewilderment. The interior of the Yon Mach Sword Manor, which had been peaceful just moments ago, had turned into a battlefield. The warriors of the Yon Mach Sword Manor and the unidentified masked individuals were entangled in combat, and it was difficult to fathom how this situation had unfolded. "Madam, what in the world is going on?" The manor master asked Lady Siak, the first wife, who was standing helplessly in front of the main hall. The vassals and the inner manor master, Zhang Myongyin, were engaged in battle with the masked individuals, so the only ones he could ask were her and the second wife, Lady Zhang. In response, Lady Siak spoke with a perplexed expression. I don't know. It hasn't been long since the outer courtyard guards suddenly shouted about an enemy attack, and in an instant, the masked individuals rushed in, resulting in this situation. Sister-in-law is right. It happened so abruptly that we too are at a loss. At the wives' words, the manor master's expression darkened. Even if it was a surprise attack in the middle of the night, for them to possess the strength to swiftly break through the defensive line of the Yon Mach Sword Manor's outer courtyard and push their way in, they were no ordinary individuals. Xing. Manor Master Mach and Dan drew his sword with his unfamiliar left hand. Although he didn't know who these people were, it was too much for the vassals and warriors to handle alone. The manor master unleashed a powerful roar, raising his sword energy. Who dares to invade the great Yon Mach Sword Manor? You must be prepared to forfeit your lives." Wah! At the sight of the Manor Master, the warriors confronting the masked individuals let out a cheer. With their lord, who had been bedridden for a long time, making an appearance, their morale couldn't help but soar. "Let's go. Let's protect the Yon Mok Sword Manor." Swoosh. As Manor Master Mok Indan took the lead and leaped forward, the Mok family brothers and the two wives from martial arts backgrounds were also inspired and followed behind him, shouting, "Protect the Yon Mok Sword Manor." Of course, not everyone participated. Mok Jong-un was the only one who didn't join the battlefield. He naturally pretended to follow along, then slipped to the side and moved to a place with few watchful eyes. It's about time to leave. There was no need for him to defend this place. He didn't care whether they fought the masked individuals and died or not. Only one thing bothered him. The scar on the side of Manor Master Mok Indan's body. It resembled that mark. He wanted to ask how he had acquired it, but coincidentally, an incident had occurred. Should I help? He was in a dilemma. At that moment, Mok Jong-un felt a strange sense of fulfillment. It was none other than the energy of death. Mok Jong-un closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and savored the rapidly increasing energy of death. Excellent. It seemed that a considerable number of people had died in a short period. Otherwise, there was no way the energy of death would be overflowing from all directions like this. Thus, he couldn't possibly ignore it. I want to absorb it. Opportunities like this were extremely rare. However, masked individuals were popping out from various places, so if he let his guard down even for a moment, it could be dangerous. Swish! At that moment, someone appeared beside him. It was a beautiful woman with an alluring appearance, the protector Go-chan who had taken over Ha Kirin's body. "Young master, are you all right?" He had hurriedly searched for Mok Jong-un due to the sudden attack. Finding him wasn't too difficult since their fates were connected. In response, Mok Jong-un chuckled and said, "This is perfect. Can you guard me for a moment?" "Pardon? Then I'll leave it to you." With those words, Mok Jong-un sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. He then began absorbing the energy of death, which was continuously flowing from the surroundings, through the reverse breathing technique. No. What is he doing? At this sight, Go-chan was momentarily dumbfounded. Even if he had no attachment to this Yon Mok Sword Manor, was he out of his mind, or was he truly this audacious? To think of circulating energy in a place that was no different from a battlefield. However, Go-chan had a sense of why Mok Jong-un was doing this. He's absorbing not energy, but this. Although he had possessed Ha Kirin's body, Go-chan was a vengeful spirit. Therefore, he possessed the eyes of the spirit and could see the energy of the deceased rapidly being absorbed by Mok Jong-un from all directions. In the eyes of the spirit, the yang energy or life force of living humans appeared clear and warm. However, Mok Jong-un's appearance as he absorbed the energy of death was nearly the opposite. Is he really human? To think he would discover this fellow's true nature only after dying. For some reason, he became even more frightening. At that moment, swish! Suddenly, a hulking monk wearing a skull prayer bead necklace appeared from somewhere. It was the demonic monk who had possessed the body of the outer Manor Master. But why had the demonic monk reappeared in the form of a vengeful spirit? Oh my! Momentarily startled by the sudden appearance, Go-chan recalled that Mok Jong-un had mentioned having another spirit servant besides Chingryong. I clearly heard that he had possessed the outer Manor Master's body. Go-chan asked in bewilderment, Could it be that you are senior demonic monk?" The demonic monk nodded and said something. It sounded a bit mumbled, but Go-chan understood what he was saying. "You lost your body to a powerful opponent." Losing one's body meant that the possessed body had been defeated. As far as Go-chan knew, the outer Manor Master Sang-ung-beek was a supreme master at the early stage of the Peak Realm. But if he had lost his body, just how powerful was the opponent? Crunch. Ugh. At that moment, along with the sound of something being crushed, a death cry rang out, and a large man with a thick sword of the Taoist sect slung over his shoulder and a body covered in scars jumped over the pavilion. He exuded an ominous aura, and the demonic monk frowned and pointed at him with his finger. "Oh, what? That man?" Was he saying that man had killed the demonic monk's possessed body? As they were conversing, the eyes of the scarred man and Go-chan met. At that moment, flinch. What? The keen senses of Ha-Kirin, who had reached the pinnacle of peak realm, were strongly warning him. They were telling him that the man before his eyes was an extraordinary master. If Ha-Kirin's body was instinctively on extreme alert to this extent, just how high was his level of mastery? It was impossible to gauge. Chapter 45. Ambush 2. Whoosh. The amount was incomparable to the energy generated by the death of a single person. The death energy created by the deaths of dozens of people was not only vast in quantity, but also deep in purity. This was because it contained all the negative emotions at the very moment of death. Excellent. While circulating energy using the reverse breathing technique, it was far more than when he had absorbed the energy of the malevolent spirit, Gu-Yo of the two demons and two spirits. This was unexpected. The risk he had taken was worthwhile. At this rate, he seemed likely to achieve his goal faster than originally anticipated. Twice, no, perhaps even 3 times, it was about expanding the diameter of his danjian. He was concentrating the high-purity energy flowing in through energy circulation, and if done well, it might be possible to triple it. Of course, he had no idea what level of internal energy this corresponded to. As Mok Jong-un focused on circulating energy, Go-chan, who was tasked with guarding him, was extremely tense. It's reckless. If Ha-Kirin's body, which had reached the pinnacle of peak realm, was on such high alert, there was no chance of victory. Where did such a monster appear from? At that moment, the scarred man shifted his gaze from Go-chan to Mok Jong-un, who was immersed in energy circulation. Then, with an intrigued expression, he spoke. Engaging in energy circulation amidst the chaos of an unknown enemy's appearance and the spilling of blood. What an interesting child. He then began to approach with long strides. It looked like he was merely walking, but he swiftly closed the distance from the pavilion in just a few steps. Gasp, startled, Go-chan felt it was futile and called out to Mok Jong-un. "Young master." He wanted to shake him and tell him to come to his senses, but if he accidentally disrupted him during energy circulation, it could lead to Kai deviation. "Young master?" Go-chan called out to Mok Jong-un once more. However, there was no response. Instead, he seemed to be in a state of self-transcendence, accelerating his energy circulation even further. Whoosh! All the surrounding death energy was visibly being absorbed at a tremendous speed, making it difficult to interrupt the process midway. In the end, Go-chan concluded that his only option was to buy time. Come to think of it, he was already dead. He couldn't let Mok Jong-un come to harm out of concern for the possessed body getting injured. Whoosh! Go-chan sent energy to his feet acupoint and stomped his foot. At that moment, Ha-Kirin's possessed body shot forward at an incredible speed. It was incomparably faster than his original body. Tap, 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 tap. In an instant, he circled the scarred man's vicinity twice. "Ho-ho, quite fast indeed," the scarred man muttered. However, it didn't sound like praise at all, and he wasn't even assuming a defensive stance. Go-chan bit his lower lip. "He's looking down on me, isn't he? Flying kill martial arts, third stance, engraving silent performance." A martial arts technique naturally came to mind. The unique martial art that Flying Killing Yama's guest took pride in. The Flying Kill martial arts third stance, engraving silent performance one, instinctively unfolded from his body. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Go-chan somersaulted in the air and unleashed his leg techniques towards the scarred man. 6 windmill-like kicks accurately targeted the vital points along the center line. He thought the man would dodge or block them in some way, but shudder. Suddenly, startled by the sharp killing intent, Go-chan twisted his body to the side. Swish! Severed strands of hair scattered in all directions. When, if he had been a moment later, that huge Taoist sword would have sliced his body in half. As he twisted his body, Go-chan threw 3 lustrous jade flying needles which he had drawn from his bracelet towards the face of the scarred man. Swish, swish, swish. Clang, clang, clang. However, the man easily deflected them with his Taoist sword. Moreover, as if that wasn't enough, thud. Ugh! With an invisible angle, he accurately struck Go Chan's abdomen with his left fist. Go Chan let out a dying scream as he was sent flying backward, tumbling several times. Thud, thud, thud. Cough! Blood flowed from his mouth as he coughed. The difference in skills was evident after just a single exchange. However, Go Chan's eyes gleamed with surprise. It wasn't because the scarred man was incredibly strong, but because the pain from that strike wasn't agonizing. What is this? Strangely, his stomach churned and he felt nauseous. Yet the sensation of pain itself was still absent. Because of this, Go Chan could recognize that he was possessing someone else's body. It feels strange, but now wasn't the time to dwell on this peculiar feeling. Go Chan trembled as he raised his body. Even if the sensation of pain itself was absent, the fact that his body had suffered an impact remained unchanged. Thus, his legs wouldn't properly support his weight. "Woman, if you try to stop me one more time, you'll die." The scarred man warned in a low voice. Those words made Go Chan feel somewhat offended. "Who are you calling a woman?" "Stop right there." Swish, swish, swish. At that moment, someone shouted and leaped forward. He then blocked Go Chan's path and aimed his sword at the scarred man. It was none other than Mok Yuchen. "Young Master Mok? Miss, are you all right?" At those words, Go Chan's expression turned blank. Goosebumps were about to rise all over his body. Glancing at the dumbfounded Go Chan, Mok Yuchen spoke with a forceful tone. "Ahem. Miss, please step back as it's dangerous. I will handle this man." As a man, he could tell, Mok Yuchen was putting on quite a show. Because of that, Go Chan couldn't bear the cringe. Regardless, Mok Yuchen politely bowed to the scarred man, perhaps to make a good impression, and said, "I am Mok Yuchen, the fourth son of the Yon Mok sword manor. May I ask for what reason you have entered our clan and caused this commotion?" At Mok Yuchen's words, the scarred man chuckled. Then he looked Mok Yuchen up and down and spoke. "Interesting. To think I would encounter two promising individuals in a place like this." "What do you mean?" "Young lad, you have no right to question me." With those words, the scarred man exuded a strong, oppressive aura. He merely revealed his killing intent, but Mok Yuchen's heart raced. Strong. As a supreme master at the early stage of the peak realm, Mok Yuchen could gauge how powerful the man before him was. Perhaps he was a master on par with his father before he lost his arm. It had been a long time since he felt such trembling. The scarred man then asked him, "Mok family, where is your father?" "Do not address my father so casually." Mok Yuchen raised his voice, seemingly angered by the scarred man's words. Seeing his reaction, the scarred man smirked and said, "Don't shout. Trying to conceal your fear only makes you appear weaker." "What?" Unable to restrain himself, Mok Yuchen leaped forward, intending to unleash his sword technique. So naive. To be provoked by such a trivial taunt. Swish. In an instant, as if the ground had pulled him, the scarred man's figure reached Mok Yuchen's front. What speed! It was imperceptible. The startled Mok Yuchen tried to twist his body to the left and change the trajectory of his sword technique. At that moment, the man's hand moved as flexibly as a snake, reaching towards Mok Yuchen's face. "Huh!" Mok Yuchen hastily raised his left arm. The man's palm lightly touched his wrist. The instant it made contact, a majestic energy penetrated and Mok Yuchen's body was sent flying as if it were a feather. Bam! Ugh! The force was so strong that he flew more than 5 zhang before coming to a stop. Mok Yuchen tumbled several times on the ground and spat out blood. Cough. Even though he had tried to circulate his body's protective energy upon contact, the opponent's internal energy had penetrated his viscera. It was a high-level emission technique called penetrating force stew. It exhibited exceptionally effective power against martial artists weaker than oneself, and Mok Yuchen was such an existence to the scarred man. To not even be treated as an opponent. The Taoist sword he held in his right hand remained slung over his shoulder. The gap was too overwhelming. However, he couldn't give up here. This situation wasn't a friendly spar or training. A real battle. This man was an enemy who had invaded the Yon Mok Sword Manor. If he yielded here, it would be the end. Mok Yuchen regulated his breathing and raised his body. Then Go-chan approached his side, assuming a bow stance, and said, "Young master, we need to attack together." "Miss," this bastard, for a moment, Go-chan felt the urge to tell him not to call him Miss, but he let it go. It was only natural since he was possessing a woman's body, and now wasn't the time to quibble over forms of address. As the two of them prepared to launch a joint attack, the scarred man grinned sinisterly. What foolish actions! With that, he attempted to take a step towards them. It was at that very moment. "Ha!" With a resounding shout, someone appeared and brought down a single strike on the scarred man. The scarred man, who hadn't fully unleashed his abilities when facing the two of them, grabbed his Taoist sword and swung upward. Clang. The clash of sword and blade reverberated in all directions. The energy of the two supreme masters was so strong that fierce winds swirled around them. However, even between them, there was a disparity. Bam! The one who had delivered the downward strike was eventually sent flying backward, pushed back by about 5 steps. Father! That person was none other than the manor master of the Yon Mok Sword Manor, Mok-in-dan. Drip, drip. Black blood trickled from the corner of Mok-in-dan's mouth. Having risen from his sick not long ago, he had expended a significant amount of true energy, and being unaccustomed to using his left hand, he couldn't even muster half of his prime strength. "Father!" As Mok Yuchen tried to approach, Mok-in-dan extended his hand and shook his head. "Stand back, he's not your opponent." "But, ah!" With those words, Mok-in-dan's eyes glanced at Mok Jong-un, who was sitting cross-legged and circulating energy. Why was that child doing that? Was he injured? He appeared to be fine on the outside. After a moment of puzzlement, Manor Master Mok-in-dan shifted his gaze to the approaching scarred man and spoke. "Who are you to invade our clan?" "Invade? Ha 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 ha!" At this question, the scarred man burst into laughter and took something out from his bosom. Seeing it, Mok-in-dan's expression instantly hardened. It was none other than a seal. A seal. Mok Yuchen's eyes narrowed. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed to be a seal, but why was his father so startled? As they pondered, the scarred man tossed the seal upward and caught it repeatedly, then spoke. "You should know well what this is, Manor Master Mok. How did you obtain that?" "How, you ask? Ha 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 ha! Manor Master Mok, you're quite the actor. To say such a thing after arbitrarily seizing that, which is no less than our society's treasure." Seize? Mok Yuchen looked at Mok-in-dan with an expression of incomprehension. At that moment, a shocking revelation emerged from Mok-in-dan's mouth. "Are you from the Heaven and Earth Society?" In response to this question, the scarred man grinned. It was a sign of affirmation. At this, not only Mok Yuchen but also Go-chan's eyes widened. The reason for their astonishment was simple: the Heaven and Earth Society. It was one of the colossal forces that currently divided the martial arts world of the Central Plains into 3 factions. Revering only the existence of the strong, they had once plunged the martial arts world into chaos, claiming to unify it. At that time, countless wandering warriors had lost their lives. Thus, the martial arts world still couldn't help but tremble in fear upon hearing the name of the Heaven and Earth Society. The Heaven and Earth Society. Go-chan was dumbfounded. No wonder there weren't many forces that would dare to commit such a brazen act against the Yon Mok Sword Manor, a renowned martial arts family in Anhui Province. But if it was truly the Heaven and Earth Society, it was a grave situation. No matter how much the Yon Mok Sword Manor had gained fame as a martial arts family, if they were determined to attack, they would have to be prepared for the annihilation of their clan. "Ah!" A sigh escaped from Manor Master Mok-in-dan's mouth. To think it would be the Heaven and Earth Society. Mok-in-dan's gaze turned to his youngest son, Mok Yuchen, Mok Jong-un, who was circulating energy, and the warriors of the Yon Mok Sword Manor fighting nearby. Is this my karma? Why had he been greedy back then? If only he hadn't brought that thing, such a situation wouldn't have occurred. Mok-in-dan spoke with difficulty. "If we hand that over, will you withdraw from our clan?" Father, at those words, Mok Yuchen looked at Manor Master Mok Indan with surprised eyes. Although the Manor Master's words were meant to save everyone, they were almost equivalent to surrender. His heart ached at the sight of his father's weakened appearance, which he had never witnessed before. I shouldn't have revealed the identity of our society. I was hoping for a bit more resistance. The scarred man muttered as if he was disappointed. Seeing his attitude, Mok Yuchen couldn't hide his inner fury. Unless they looked down on them to an extreme degree, they wouldn't display such an attitude. Manor Master Mok Indan sent a glance and shook his head. It meant not to act rashly. Even if you're angry, endure it, my son. The opponent is the Heaven and Earth Society. In any case, the situation was extremely unfavorable from the moment such a monster had arrived. Apart from being weakened, even if his body were intact, Manor Master Mok Indan had no confidence in handling the scarred man. The scarred man rested his Taoist sword on his shoulder and asked, "Where is it? That thing?" "Let's make a promise, make a promise, man to man first," Mok Indan demanded. The scarred man replied, "Manor Master Mok, you're not lacking in capacity as a leader. Very well. I, Sun Yun, the Bright Blade King, one of the 5 kings of the Great Heaven and Earth Society, shall make a promise. If you hand that over, I will refrain from causing further harm to the Yon Mok Sword Manor and withdraw." One of the 5 kings. Mok Indan was inwardly astounded. To think that Sun Yun, the Bright Blade King, one of the 8 executives leading the Heaven and Earth Society, had made a move. If that were the case, there was no doubt he had come with the intention of annihilating the clan if things went awry. At this realization, cold sweat trickled down Mok Indan's back. The scarred man, or rather Sun Yun, the Bright Blade King, one of the 5 kings of the Heaven and Earth Society, asked, "Where is it?" In response to that question, Mok Indan pointed somewhere and said, "Over there lies our clan's medicinal hall. Among the herb containers in the medicinal hall, if you open the drawer marked with 5 elements, an underground entrance will be revealed. Ho ho. Inside, there is a stone door engraved with the character Jiang. The passage contains mechanical traps, so you must either break through 20 steps at once using lightness skills or traverse by grasping the ceiling. Well hidden indeed. In that place, there should be a wooden box with talismans attached to it. Did you hear that?" Sun Yun, the Bright Blade King, asked one of the masked individuals beside him. "Yes," the masked individual replied. "Bring it." "Understood." The masked individual promptly vanished in the direction of the medicinal hall. He said it's hidden in a secret space inside the medicinal hall. Go Chan furrowed his brow with a perplexed expression, surreptitiously glancing at Mok Jong-un, who was still absorbing the death energy. He had a feeling that things were becoming thoroughly entangled. Chapter 46. Ambush 3. The fight between the warriors of the Yon Mok Sword Manor and the masked individuals was temporarily halted by the shout of Sun Yun, the Bright Blade King, one of the 5 kings of the Heaven and Earth Society. However, it was still not a situation where they could let their guard down. The Heaven and Earth Society remained a violent organization that had not abandoned its ambition to unify the Central Plains, so if the Bright Blade King Sun Yun were to change his mind midway, the battle would resume. "Oh, this is serious." Lady Siak, the first wife, whispered to the guard Ho Ying. From what she had heard, it seemed that they were after a secret manual or something similar that the manor master had found somewhere, and it was said to be in a hidden space within the medicinal hall. Glance. She surreptitiously glanced at Mok Jong-un, who was still circulating energy. That child. It appeared that he had found the manor master's exclusive secret manual in the medicinal hall. Otherwise, how could he have bargained with her while never leaving the medicinal hall? At this, the guard Ho Ying said to her, "Madam, shouldn't we inform the manor master about this?" "We should, but—" Lady Siak's eyes took on a peculiar expression. If she were to consider the future of the Yon Mok Sword Manor, informing the manor master now would allow him to quickly address the situation. However, a clever idea crossed Lady Siak's mind. "That child said he had only given me 2 stances of the ignited wood sword formation, and that the rest of the oral formulas were all in his head. If that were the case, given that cunning fellow's personality, there was a high probability that he had also memorized and destroyed the secret manual. She was convinced that was likely the case. Then, there was no need to inform the Manor Master right now. If someone had memorized a secret manual precious enough for the Heaven and Earth Society to consider it a treasure, how would they react? "I think it will be fine to inform him a little later," Lady Siak said, the corners of her mouth curling up slightly. If things went well, she might be able to rid herself of a troublesome tumor here. As the situation had progressed to this point, Mok Jeong-un, who had been immersed in the energy circulation, finally opened his eyes. "Young master." The guard Go-chan, who had been standing guard beside him, called out in a low voice. Mok Jeong-un glanced at him once, then surveyed the surroundings. Seeing the situation in a standstill, Mok Jeong-un smacked his lips as if disappointed. No wonder the death energy was cut off midway. It was because the fighting had ceased. Mok Jeong-un was actually disappointed that no more people were dying. However, it seemed that assessing the situation took priority at the moment. What happened? Come to think of it, why was the demonic monk in the form of a vengeful spirit, abandoning the body of the outer Manor Master? Well, as Mok Jeong-un looked puzzled, Go-chan whispered in his ear, explaining what had transpired. Mok Yuchen glanced at Mok Jeong-un with a somewhat envious gaze. When did that bastard acquire such a guard? He had never seen Go-chan before, so he couldn't help but be curious when he was introduced as Mok Jeong-un's guard. Not only was his appearance outstanding, but Mok Yuchen was particularly amazed by his martial arts prowess. Regardless, having grasped the situation to some extent, Mok Jeong-un stroked his chin and let out a soft groan. What are you going to do about this?" Go-chan looked at Mok Jeong-un with a perplexed expression. It was literally a situation where they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Soon, the masked individual from the Heaven and Earth Society who had gone to search the secret place in the medicinal hall would return. When that happened, a catastrophe could unfold. "Young master, the Heaven and Earth Society is a truly dangerous organization if we're not careful." "Wait a moment." "Yes." While Go-chan was puzzled, Mok Jeong-un approached Manor Master Mok-in-dan, who was waiting with an anxious expression. Mok-in-dan admonished him in a low voice, "If you're injured, just rest quietly. Right now. May I ask who inflicted that wound on your side?" "What?" Manor Master Mok-in-dan furrowed his brow at Mok Jeong-un's sudden question. As if the uncertain situation ahead wasn't enough, why was this child asking such a thing? The Manor Master sighed and said, "Now is not the time to discuss that. There's nothing in the underground of the medicinal hall." At those words, the Manor Master was momentarily flustered and almost blurted out a response, but he managed to hold back and surveyed the surroundings with his eyes. The bright Blade King Sun Yun was standing with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall and looking at him. Conscious of him, the Manor Master lowered his voice even more and whispered, "What do you mean by that? There's nothing in the underground of the medicinal hall. What on earth?" "It's exactly as I said. So if you tell me where, how, and by whom you received that wound on your side, I will handle this situation." At Mok Jeong-un's words, Manor Master Mok-in-dan's eyes turned fierce. Mok-in-dan glared at Mok Jeong-un and said, "Did you perhaps go to the underground?" "Yes." "How did you—" For a moment, he wanted to grab the back of his neck. How did this kid find out about that place and go there? And he couldn't understand why he was so fixated on this wound, but that wasn't what mattered right now. "Don't tell me you tampered with that." "Please tell me first." "You—" The Yon Mok Sword Manor was in a life-or-death crisis, so what kind of behavior was this? With anger surging, Manor Master Mok-in-dan grabbed Mok Jeong-un's wrist, and applying force, he said, "Grip. Where is it? Tell me right now. The future of our clan is at stake. I can't tolerate your mischief in this situation." "Does it seem like mischief to you?" Manor Master Mok-in-dan frowned. Was this really the same child he knew? He was gripping his wrist so tightly and imposing his authority, yet the child didn't avert his eyes at all and showed no sign of fear. "You—" It was at that very moment. Tap, 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 tap. A masked individual was seen rushing over in a hurry. Seeing this, Manor Master Mayhem Dan's expression hardened. It was the masked individual he had sent to the medicinal hall. The bright blade king Sun Yun, who had been leaning against the wall, straightened his body and said, "Did you find it?" "It's here." The masked individual knelt on one knee and respectfully presented an old wooden box with talismans pasted all over it. Sun Yun also received the wooden box with both hands, unable to hide his excitement. "It has returned to the hands of our society once again." Seeing this, Manor Master Mayhem Dan asked Mayhem, did you lie to your father?" Otherwise, there was no way the wooden box would be there so intact. Mayhem Dan, who had been worried that a big commotion would occur, let out a sigh of relief as the tension seemed to dissipate. If they took that and left, there would be no further damage. Click. At that moment, the bright blade king Sun Yun raised one eyebrow and opened the lid of the wooden box. It seemed he wanted to check if the contents were inside. However, whoosh. Instantly, an immense killing intent erupted from the bright blade king Sun Yun. The force was so strong that everyone, whether from the Yon Mok sword manor or the masked individuals, flinched for a moment. Why all of a sudden? Manor Master Mayhem Dan, who had been feeling relieved, was baffled. Mayhem Dan looked at Mayhem. Could it be that the contents were missing? "I did tell you." At Mayhem's words, Mayhem Dan was not only angry but also dumbfounded. Was this kid really in his right mind? However, unlike him, there was one person who welcomed this situation. It was none other than Lady Siak, the first wife. Perfect, she had wondered if Mayhem hadn't tampered with the wooden box. But judging by that man's reaction, it seemed that wasn't the case. Now was the opportunity. Lady Siak took a step forward, and just as she was about to open her mouth, the bright blade king Sun Yun took something out of the wooden box with his thumb and index finger. It was an earring. It was a lavish earring made of jade and silver. There was only one, and it looked like something women would wear. Seeing this, Lady Siak couldn't hide her bewilderment. That was because it should have been in her jade ornament box. But why was it there? It was enough to make even ghosts wail. Wait, could it be? Startled, Lady Siak looked in the direction where Mayhem was. She had intended to look at Mayhem, but her eyes met with Manor Master Mayhem Dan, who was standing next to him. Mayhem Dan had an expression that asked what on earth was going on. And for good reason, of all things, that one. It was one of the ornaments she had received as a gift from Manor Master Mayhem Dan. It was only natural for Mayhem Dan to show suspicion. As she was flustered, she noticed Mayhem chuckling and shrugging his shoulders beside him. "You." Only then did she confirm that it was Mayhem's doing. He was the only one who had gone to that place. At that moment, the bright blade king Sun Yun held up the earring towards Manor Master Mayhem Dan and blatantly exuded killing intent as he spoke. "Manor Master Mo. What is this?" Mayhem Dan was at a loss for words at that question. It was already a problem that the secret manual wrapped in the prayer beads was missing, but he couldn't say that the earring belonged to his wife. "You've finally chosen to be punished." Xing. The bright blade king Sun Yun drew the Taoist sword he had been carrying on his back. The masked individuals followed suit. As they put away their weapons and drew their swords again, the warriors of the Yon Mok sword manor also pulled out their weapons with tense expressions. It was a situation on the brink of explosion. At that moment, Mayhem shouted, "First, madam, when our clan is in danger, do you intend to keep your mouth shut and remain still? Isn't that earring yours?" Lady Siak was momentarily at a loss for words. She had already been at a loss because she knew it was her earring, but she hadn't expected Mayhem to suddenly bring her into the situation. "You, what are you?" "Ho ho, so this earring belonged to the manor master's wife." The bright blade king Sun Yun glared at Lady Siak as he spoke. Feeling fear from his sharp gaze and aura, Lady Siak staggered and took a step back. She waved her hands and said, warrior son, I think there's some misunderstanding. This is..." "Eldest madam. You can end this without bloodshed, so why are you doing this? If you have the secret manual, please give it quickly." This bastard. At Mayhem's shout, she felt like she was going crazy. She wanted to rip Mok Jong-un's mouth apart right then and there. But that monster-like Supreme Master from the Heaven and Earth Society, whom even the Manor Master couldn't handle, was glaring at her as if he would kill her, so she couldn't open her lips. Grip. Manor Master Mok-in-dan grabbed Mok Jong-un's wrist and urged him in a low voice, "Enough. Pardon? What on earth are you doing? No matter how much she's not your birth mother, how could you? You're more naive than you look." "What?" "That woman even called a diviner to find out from your mouth where the Manor Master's exclusive secret manual was, and then she tried to have you killed. And you still think of protecting her." At those words, Mok-in-dan's expression hardened. What in the world was this about? As he was perplexed, Mok Jong-un whispered with a curl of his lips, "So you don't have to feel too guilty. If, by some stroke of luck, we can save everyone with the sacrifice of that one woman, wouldn't that be a good thing in its own way?" It was like a devil's tempting whisper. At this, Manor Master Mok-in-dan felt a chill run through his entire body. Chapter 47. Ambush 4. Could this be described as merely a change? Mok Jong-un, who nonchalantly suggested sacrificing Lady Seok, who was, despite their poor relationship, still his mother in name, left Mok-in-dan momentarily shocked to the point of sending chills throughout his body. Beyond being different, it seemed as if he had become a completely different person. At that moment, Mok Jong-un whispered in a sweet voice, "She's a woman who left the Manor Master to die and tried to give everything to her own son. Is there any value in hesitating?" This kid, whether it was true or not, wasn't important. Mok Jong-un was providing him with an emotional justification to make a cruel choice. It was a justification that could sufficiently tempt him, both as a leader trying to save a group and as a person. However, no. Mok-in-dan bit his lip firmly, and releasing Mok Jong-un's wrist, which he had been holding, he urged in a low voice, "I cannot trust your words. It's the truth. Even if what you say is true, I cannot say it's right to sacrifice someone to save others. And—" Manor Master Mok-in-dan looked at the face of Lady Seok, who was taking a step back. Her fearful eyes showed strong denial. He knew her well as his wife. If she had done something, she would have feigned ignorance rather than reacting like this. "As I thought, it's not. If that was the case, if that was your doing, let me tell you it was a foolish act." "A foolish act?" "Yes, and now is not the time to deal with you." Swoosh. With those words, Mok-in-dan tried to block the bright blade King Sun Yun, who was approaching Lady Seok. But before he could do so, crunch! Sun Yun, who had been walking towards her as if he was about to do something, tightly clenched the earring in his hand. Scattering the crushed earring on the ground, Sun Yun said, "It seems there is someone here who dislikes the Manor Master's wife." What? Overwhelmed by the intense killing intent emanating from Sun Yun, she stammered in a cold sweat. Sun Yun scoffed and said, "Someone among the Yon Mok Sword Manor's inner circle either wanted to frame you or have you killed by borrowing someone else's blade." Borrowing someone else's blade to kill one. It literally meant borrowing someone else's sword to kill. At Sun Yun's words, her tension dissipated and her legs gave out, causing her to collapse to the ground. Sun Yun exuded killing intent and glared at the people of the Yon Mok Sword Manor with sharp eyes, saying, "Do you think I'll fall for such a trick?" At those words, Manor Master Mok-in-dan gritted his teeth and sent a glare at Mok Jong-un. Look, this was the foolish act he had mentioned. If one looked at the bigger picture rather than focusing on the details, the situation would become apparent to some extent. What kind of culprit would leave their traces so blatantly? It was more like revealing that an enemy had left them. He made a bad move. No matter how cunning he tried to be, this was the limit of a scheme devised by a mere 17-year-old's mind. Mok-in-dan frowned at Mok Jong-un and whispered, "The situation has worsened. This can't go on, hand it over." "How unfortunate." "What?" "I was hoping for good luck." Now is not the time for such words. It was at that very moment. Swish! The bright blade King Sun Yun swung his Taoist sword and beheaded one of the Yon Mok Sword Manor's warriors. It happened so swiftly that there was no time to stop it. "Bright blade King!" Clang. Manor Master Mok-in-dan shouted in anger as he drew his sword. Sun Yun shrugged his shoulders and joked, You're the ones who broke the promise, yet you're angry at me. I declare to the people of the Yon Mok Sword Manor. Declare, declare, declare. His voice, infused with internal energy, echoed loudly like a reverberating sound. Those nearby covered their ears, agonizing over the ringing in their eardrums. He wasn't using his full strength. Mok-Indan's expression darkened. During the earlier exchange of blows, he had underestimated Sun Yun's profound mastery of internal energy. Even if his body were intact, Sun Yun was not an opponent he could defeat. Regardless, Sun Yun continued his speech. I'll give you one last chance. If you want to live, either hand over that thing, or tell me who would benefit the most from the death of the Manor Master's wife. At his shout, the corners of Lady Siok's mouth trembled as she knelt on the ground, regulating her breathing. She hadn't expected to suffer such humiliation because of that damn Mok Jong-un. Originally, she had kept her mouth shut out of consideration for the Manor Master, but now that things had turned out this way, she was in no position to hold back. Lady Siok parted her lips. Warrior son. Before she could finish her sentence, at that moment, someone raised their hand and shouted, I know who did this. The one who shouted was none other than Ho Ying. Seeing her, Lady Siok closed her mouth approvingly. It was better for Ho Ying, the guard, to truthfully report the facts out of loyalty rather than Lady Siok herself. You know who it is? Yes. The bright blade King Sun Yun wiped the blood from his Taoist sword and spoke in a voice filled with killing intent. If it's a lie, you'll have to forfeit your life. If the first madam is harmed, it will also put the eldest young master of our clan in a difficult position. Therefore, there are those who would benefit in the succession structure. Although unintentional, the gazes of the Yon Mok Sword Manor's warriors naturally divided between two individuals. They were none other than the second son, Mok Yunpyong, and the youngest, Mok Yuchen. As humans, it was inevitable for their gazes to momentarily shift. Mok Yunpyong shouted in surprise, what nonsense are you spouting now? Mok Yuchen was no different. How rude, Guard Ho, why would I do such a thing? The two of them reacted with a sense of injustice. It was only natural for them to do so. After all, they hadn't committed the deed themselves. However, the curious thing was that not a single person looked at Mok Jong-un upon hearing Ho Ying's words. This, Manor Master Mok-Indan frowned. Judging by Mok Jong-un's attempt to bargain with him, if anyone had plotted something, it had to be this child. But when Ho Ying mentioned those who would benefit in the succession structure, no one among the Yon Mok Sword Manor's people looked at Mok Jong-un. That was because he had the least power and potential. At that moment, the bright blade King Sun Yun alternately glanced at the second son, Mok Yunpyong, and the youngest, Mok Yuchen, and spoke, It sounds plausible, but how can I believe that? There is something that can be considered evidence. Evidence? Ho ho! Do tell, woman. Evidence. At the guard Ho Ying's words, Lady Siok furrowed her brow. Was there anything that could be considered evidence? As she wondered, Ho Ying said, In the underground of the medicinal hall, along with the item Hero Sun is looking for, there were also secret manuals that only the Manor Master of the Yon Mok Sword Manor could cultivate. The one who possesses them must have been behind this. At Ho Ying's words, two individuals simultaneously failed to hide their bewilderment. They were the youngest, Mok Yuchen, and Lady Siok, who possessed the original secret manuals, the Ignited Wood Heart Transformation Method and the Ignited Wood Sword Formation, albeit only the cover and 2 pages. Startled, they shouted simultaneously, No! Ho Ying, you! Having shouted at the same time, they realized their mistake as attention focused on them and became flustered, not knowing what to do. They shouldn't have reacted like this to Ho Ying's words. It was obvious that they would search their residences. Ha! Seeing their reaction, Manor Master Mok-Indan looked at Mok Jong-un. Mok-Indan's eyes trembled at the sight of Mok Jong-un, who was looking at the scene as if it were an entertaining spectacle. If, by some stroke of luck, we can save everyone with the sacrifice of that one woman, wouldn't that be a good thing in its own way? How unfortunate. I was hoping for good luck. The words Mok Jong-un had spoken flashed through his mind. The luck this kid had mentioned wasn't the kind of meaning he had understood. "You," Mok Jong-un whispered with a smile on his lips. "This is quite a big problem. Instead of ending it with one, everyone is getting involved. At this rate, whether it's the secret manual or whatever, that scary fellow might go on a rampage and kill everyone." "What? You want me to put this earring in that wooden box?" "Yes. Are you stupid, mortal? What do you mean? If you put it in there, who would believe it was that old mortal woman? They would suspect it was the doing of someone targeting that lady Siak or whatever her name is. Yes, that's the intention." "What? Why do you think I gave them the secret manual? That's practically just a shell." "You don't tell me. Let's just say it's a small precaution in case the manor master wakes up." "Well, it's a harmless prank." "A harmless prank? You sure know how to use your wits. Originally, it was a precaution in case the manor master woke up and checked the secret place." Although it differed from his intention, thanks to that, the chaos intensified. Mok Jong-un curled the corners of his mouth and said, "Rather than regretting after losing one or two, wouldn't it be better to tell me about that wound now?" Clench. Manor Master Mok-in-dan gritted his teeth. This bastard, what on earth? The thought of him being his son had disappeared. He had never encountered someone so terrifyingly cunning. Seeing Mok Jong-un hold the danger to the Yon Mok Sword Manor hostage to obtain what he wanted left Mok-in-dan not only dumbfounded, but also exasperated to the point of feeling nauseous. "What will you do?" There was no longer any room for choice. Mok-in-dan said, "Bring the secret manual and hand it over to that man, then I will tell you." "That's not how a negotiation works." "You really?" "We don't have much time." Mok-in-dan, who had been glaring at Mok Jong-un with a distorted face, parted his lips with trembling cheeks. 17 years ago, in Yangmun, Guangdong Province, I suffered this wound from the one called the Ghost Blade too. Ghost Blade? You, don't tell me you don't know the Ghost Blade. There was no way he would know. Mok Jong-un, who had only recently started learning martial arts, had no way of knowing about the ecology of the martial arts world. "Who is the Ghost Blade?" Before he could finish his sentence. Jingle, jingle, the sound of bells ringing could be heard. In an instant, everyone's gaze turned towards the source of the sound. "Diviner Joe!" The bright Blade King Sun Yun called out to someone entering the pavilion. It was a middle-aged man wearing an eye patch with a snake design and holding a walking stick. However, more puzzling than this man's appearance was the fact that the bells at his waist were ringing on their own without even shaking. What on earth? As they pondered, the middle-aged man with the eye patch, called Diviner Joe, spoke. "An evil spirit is playing tricks." "An evil spirit? The evil spirit is trying to steal a human's shell." Pack. At that moment, the middle-aged man swung his walking stick in the air and formed a hand seal with his left hand, chanting a spell. "The divine must move swiftly. The loyal and righteous protect the emperor. The self is at peace. The demons are subdued. The 5 peaks and the venerable lord, hurry, hurry, in accordance with the law and order." Boom. As soon as the spell ended, the middle-aged man struck the ground with his walking stick. Along with it, an invisible shockwave was generated, and a strong wind suddenly blew through the surroundings. Whoosh. "Ah, arg." Then Ho-Ying, Lady Siak's guard, who was hit by the sweeping wind, suddenly grabbed her head and screamed like a madwoman. Those around her couldn't hide their astonishment for a moment. Black veins bulged grotesquely around Ho-Ying's neck, making it extremely bizarre. "WH what?" Thud, thud, thud. Ho-Ying's eyes rolled back, and her entire body convulsed wildly. Everyone was startled and distanced themselves from her. Gulp, gulp. Although not to the same extent as Ho-Ying, there was one person who felt his stomach churning. Go-chan. The moment the wind swept by, he felt an unpleasant sensation and the urge to vomit. However, as soon as he circulated his internal energy and activated his body's protective energy, he felt somewhat better. Huff, huff. Go-chan looked at Ho-Ying. In Go-chan's ghostly eyes, he could see the demonic monk suffering in agony inside Ho-Ying's body. Because the body was merely second-rate and he had just possessed it, he couldn't endure it. Eventually, he was ejected from the possessed body. Ho-Ying, who had been convulsing and suffering, collapsed on the spot as if she had fainted. Thud. Seeing this, the corners of the middle-aged man with the eye patch, called Diviner Joe, curled up. "I shall exorcise you." He then took out a talisman of the Imperial Command spell from his waist, attached it to his walking stick, and shouted, "The true ghost is exterminated, the 5 peaks and the venerable Lord command. The divine soldiers lead the way, hurry, hurry, in accordance with the law and order." With that, he threw the walking stick. Swish! Surprisingly, the walking stick extended straight and flew like an arrow. To everyone's eyes, it appeared to be flying towards an empty space where no one was present, but the demonic monk was still there, staggering in pain. However, before the walking stick imbued with a mysterious power could reach the demonic monk, someone caught the walking stick midway. "You're doing something troublesome." It was none other than Mok Jong-un. At this sight, the middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, couldn't hide his astonishment for a moment. What? To catch a walking stick imbued with the Imperial Command spell and incantations with his bare hands, even if he was from a martial arts family, he was no ordinary person. However, what was truly astonishing wasn't that. Diviner Joe frowned and glared at Mok Jong-un, saying, "You can see vengeful spirits." At those words, the surroundings stirred. Chapter 48. The Heaven and Earth Society 1. What is the talent of a diviner? There would be several qualifications. Among those qualifications, a sense of spiritual energy is naturally included. As a simple example, everyone has probably experienced the sudden appearance of goosebumps or chills at least once. It could be a natural bodily phenomenon, but that is the basis of spiritual sensation. When in contact with something spiritual, the soul within the body reacts, affecting the 5 senses. However, ordinary people find it difficult to discern this. This is because the boundary between the living and the dead is clear. This could only be developed through innate spiritual talent or training. However, among these talent requirements, there existed the ultimate talent that only a select few were born with. You possess the eyes. That is none other than vision, the eyes that can accurately see beyond the boundary, unlike other senses. Diviners regarded possessing the eyes that could distinguish this as the highest. The middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, saw Mok Jong-un precisely looking at the evil spirit before catching the walking stick he had thrown after attaching the Imperial Command spell and infusing it with incantations. It's certain. The kid possessed the highest qualifications as a diviner. Even he, who could barely perceive the form with the naked eye after training under the best master, didn't possess the talent that this child from a martial arts family had. "You can see vengeful spirits." Murmur, murmur. At his words, the surroundings stirred. He can see vengeful spirits. What does that mean? Vengeful spirits, does that refer to ghosts or evil spirits? Manor Master Mok In-dan and the Mok family brothers frowned and looked at Mok Jong-un. In fact, most of their reactions were similar. This has become troublesome. Mok Jong-un clicked his tongue inwardly. He had acted on impulse, not wanting to lose the demonic monk, but it seemed to have complicated matters. Should he have given up even if it was a waste? However, it was too late for that now. A diviner. It seemed to be the case. Some of the spells he had chanted earlier were seen in books related to magical techniques left behind by Fang assassin Sack. They were typical techniques for exorcising evil spirits or the 2 demons and 2 spirits. However, a part of the incantation was different. If that was the case, he's from a different group than that woman Sack. He seemed to belong to this organization called the Heaven and Earth Society. At that moment, the middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, said, "Since when were you able to see vengeful spirits?" "Pardon. You can see vengeful spirits, can't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Seeing Mok Jong-un's feigned ignorance, the middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, raised one eyebrow in puzzlement. Does that child want to hide his eyes? However, if that were the case, he shouldn't have intervened in the first place. Diviner Joe scoffed and changed his question. "Interesting. Fine, I'll change the question. Why did you prevent the exorcism of the vengeful spirit?" I have no idea what you've been talking about since earlier." Mok Jong-un feigned ignorance nonchalantly. Diviner Joe chuckled and then formed a hand seal, saying, "You don't know, then I suppose it's fine if I exercise that evil thing again." Pack, 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 bing a Chinese letter, do Chinese letter, lie Chinese letter, Zhen Chinese letter. It was the hand seals of the 9-character activating method. Different. Mok Jong-un's eyes narrowed. He had memorized all the books possessed by diviners Myo Sin, Sak, and others. However, the hand seals he was forming were new to him. Moreover, he was only forming hand seals without incantations, yet the spiritual energy in the surroundings was becoming strangely abundant. Tremble, tremble. However, it was not visible to others. They only saw him bringing his hands together, bending and extending his fingers, overlapping them. At that moment, Diviner Joe formed a square by aiming with his index and middle fingers. Then, whoosh, 4 invisible pillars shot up from the surroundings. The pillars precisely enclosed Mok Jong-un and the demonic monk, gradually thickening. The middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, muttered softly, "4 peaks linking technique 1." As soon as he finished, walls formed from the 4 thickened pillars. The demonic monk, unable to escape anywhere, looked around in bewilderment. "Shrink, Chinese letter." Diviner Joe extended his palm towards the demonic monk and made a grasping gesture. Whoosh! At that moment, the 4 walls enclosing the demonic monk began to compress and slowly shrink. If they were to shrink completely, the demonic monk might be crushed. Mok Jong-un's eyes turned sharp. This man's level was clearly different from the diviners he had encountered so far. He had never seen such a magical technique before. No choice. Since he didn't know what kind of technique it was, there was only one way to break it. Attack the caster, the diviner. Tap. Take it back. Mok Jong-un gripped the walking stick like a spear and threw it towards Diviner Joe, who was performing the magical technique. Swish. If the caster is disrupted or killed midway, most magical techniques will unravel. However, the masked individuals wouldn't let this happen without interference. Clang. One of the masked individuals near Diviner Joe swiftly leaped forward and struck down the flying walking stick with the blade of his sword. "You impudent brat!" The masked individual tried to charge directly at Mok Jong-un, who had targeted Diviner Joe. However, Diviner Joe stopped him. "Enough." "Pardon? No need for you to intervene." "Understood." The masked individual stopped the attack without any objection. It was a group with a clear hierarchy of command and obedience. Diviner Joe said to Mok Jong-un, "You don't seem to be possessed or bewitched, so if you explain why you're trying to protect the vengeful spirit, I can pause the technique for now." He'll have no choice but to surrender eventually. In any case, the situation was in his favor. Even if he had the eyes without training, it was of no use. Judging by that child's appearance, he hadn't received proper training as a diviner. That much was evident at a glance. Moreover, the 4 peaks linking technique was a high-level technique that required at least the Fang Yu level to perform, making it difficult to break with ordinary techniques. However, Diviner Joe's expression hardened as he looked at Mok Jong-un. It was because pack, pack, pack. Mok Jong-un was forming the exact same hand seals that Diviner Joe had just formed without a single discrepancy. Bing, Chinese letter. Do, Chinese letter. Lie, Chinese letter. Zhen, Chinese letter. What? It was the hand seals of the 9-character activating method. Diviner Joe was dumbfounded by Mok Jong-un's hand seals. No matter how he looked at it, this child seemed to be an ordinary person with no knowledge of magical techniques. Yet, he imitated the hand seals so accurately. What an absurd child. Does he think he can stop it by imitating it? If it were that easy, everyone would have done it. Forming hand seals without incantations or talismans is only possible for those at the diviner's level moon or above. Whoosh. At that moment, Diviner Joe doubted his own eyes. 4 small pillars, invisible to ordinary people, were formed. The shape was blunt and quite crude, but it was unmistakable. "Ha!" A soft exclamation escaped Diviner Joe's mouth. It was a level of magical technique achieved through long years of practice. Yet he imitated it after seeing it once and actually succeeded. Could it be that this fellow has learned magical techniques? At that moment, Mok Jong-un muttered, 4 peaks linking technique, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Then, walls connected the 4 pillars. It was an unbelievable sight to behold. However, what was even more surprising was the location where Mok Jong-un had performed the 4 peaks linking technique. Pack, 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 pack. He had used the 4 peaks linking technique inside the 4 peaks linking technique that was being compressed by the shrink, Chinese letter, command. As a result, the compression of the 4 peaks linking technique stopped as it collided with the newly formed 4 peaks linking technique from within. This fellow, look at that. Not only did he imitate the technique, but he also blocked it in this manner. It demonstrated remarkable adaptability. At this point, he couldn't help but have doubts. Who taught you magical techniques? Why would I need to learn such a thing? It wasn't a lie. He hadn't learned it from someone, but had self-studied it from books related to magical techniques. Tremble, tremble. Mok Jong-un shook his hands with the 9 character activating method's hand seals in the Zhen Chinese letter state. It was to block Diviner Zhou's shrinking 4 peaks linking technique. Although he had somehow managed to block it with a quick response, the difference in mastery was undeniable. Seeing this, Diviner Zhou's eyes took on a peculiar expression. Did he really not learn it? The adaptability and the ability to immediately imitate and manifest the hand seals. All of this was nearly impossible without an exceptional master. Diviner Zhou stared intently at Mok Jong-un, and then, clap, he released the hand seal and said, "Release Chinese letter." With those words, the 4 peaks linking technique that had been compressing disappeared. Mok Jong-un looked at him with puzzled eyes. Diviner Zhou burst into laughter. Ha 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 ha! Why was he suddenly acting like this? As he wondered, Diviner Zhou turned his head and said to the Bright Blade King Sun Yun, "Bright Blade King, you may kill everyone else, but leave this child to me." Everyone's eyes widened. He seemed to be a diviner of the Heaven and Earth Society, but he suddenly asked to hand over Mok Jong-un. What did this mean? As they pondered, Sun Yun clicked his tongue and said, "You're doing something unnecessary again. I should have that much authority." The Bright Blade King Sun Yun shrugged his shoulders, indicating agreement. He then raised his large Taoist sword, aimed it at the people of the Yon Mok Sword Manor, and spoke in a menacing voice. "I was going to leave if you had obediently handed over that thing, but now it's over. You brought this upon yourselves, so regret it in the afterlife." Sun Yun thought so. There was no need to sort out who had taken the secret manual one by one. If he beat them all to death, someone would eventually speak up. In any case, the secret manual was within the clan residence. Sun Yun shouted, "Kill them all!" At that moment, someone interrupted and shouted, "I have the secret manual that was wrapped in the prayer beads inside the wooden box." It was none other than Mok Jong-un. Ha! A sigh of relief escaped from Manor Master Mok In-dan, who had been tense, thinking that Sun Yun might not keep his promise. If they handed over the secret manual, they could overcome this situation. At that moment, the Bright Blade King Sun Yun approached Mok Jong-un with a terrifying aura and said, "You have it." "Yes. If it's another lie, regardless of Diviner Zhou's request, I will tear your limbs apart. Why would I deny having it?" Sun Yun's eyes gleamed at Mok Jong-un's fearless demeanor. However, it was short-lived. "Then hand it over. No, tell me where it is." He asked for the location, as Mok Jong-un might play another trick. "However, I should probably apologize first." "Apologize? You, right now. You seem to desperately want it, but I burned that secret manual." "What?" At those words, the masked individuals erupted in anger instead. That secret manual was a treasure of the Heaven and Earth Society. Hearing that he had burned such a secret manual, it would have been stranger not to be angry. However, Sun Yun raised his hand slightly to restrain them and scoffed. "Ha! For a renowned martial arts family, you've got nothing but scammers. Do you think that can be burned with fire?" What does he mean? Both the masked individuals and the people of the Yon Mok Sword Manor were puzzled. Does he not believe the fact that the secret manual was burned with fire? At that moment, Sun Yun aimed his Taoist sword directly at Mok Jong-un's neck. "Pack, you know nothing. You've never even seen the secret manual. You wasted my time, so as promised. Does it sound like a lie? Sun Yun frowned fiercely and raised his Taoist sword. "How dare you in front of this elder? Only the cover made of human skin doesn't burn, but the inner pages with the contents burn well." At those words, Sun Yun's expression, which had been filled with anger just moments ago, changed. The fact that the cover was made of human skin was known only to a few executives within the Heaven and Earth Society. By the way, the contents inside are here." Mok Jong-un tapped his head with his index finger. Sun Yun's expression hardened. Was it because Mok Jong-un had not only burned their treasure but also memorized it? As he was thinking that, Sun Yun spoke in disbelief. "You saw that? Chapter 49, the Heaven and Earth Society too. You saw that." Mok Jong-un sensed bewilderment in the bright blade King Sun Yun's expression. In the world of martial arts, he had recognized the importance of secret manuals to a certain extent. However, judging by this man's reaction, it was quite different from the anger of seeing someone who had viewed a secret manual that was no less than a treasure to them. It was a reaction of disbelief. "What is it?" At that moment, swish. The sharp blade of Sun Yun's large Taoist sword was pressed against his neck. Mok Jong-un's eyes narrowed. He had been watching the movements clearly with his eyes, yet he hadn't noticed it until it touched him, as if he hadn't perceived it. Is this a true master? Amazing. It made sense why the manner Master Mok In-dan was so tense and submissive. However, that was the extent of his admiration. In reality, if one let their guard down, they could be stabbed to death by a 5-year-old child while sleeping. It was right to be wary of everything. Sun Yun looked straight into Mok Jong-un's eyes and spoke. "You saw that and survived." "Pardon?" "Then it's one of two things. What on earth is he talking about?" As he wondered, Sun Yun continued in a chilling voice, "Either a lie or heaven's fortune." "A lie or heaven's fortune." Until now, almost no one has remained alive and breathing after seeing the contents inside. "What do you mean by that? No one remains breathing. Aren't I right here?" Sun Yun scoffed and slightly pressed the blade against his neck, saying, "It's exactly as I said. So I find it hard to believe that you're alive and well like this." "As you can see, I'm alive." Mok Jong-un shrugged his shoulders. Sun Yun clicked his tongue at his attitude. He had a sword pressed against his neck, yet there was still no change in his demeanor. Had he lost all fear? Or was he audacious? "Looking at you, I can't tell if you're spouting lies out of brazenness or taking a gamble. If I'm going to die anyway, what's the point of taking a gamble?" Sun Yun stared intently into Mok Jong-un's eyes. If he were even slightly tense or anxious, his eyes would have wavered, but they didn't. Make sure to retrieve it. He couldn't disobey that order. Then there was only one way. "Fine. Then prove it by reciting the oral formula or demonstrating the stances. Then we'll know for sure." At his proposal, Manor Master Mok In-dan and all the members of the Yon Mok Sword Manor looked on with tense gazes. Initially, when Mok Jong-un had revealed that he possessed it, they had felt a strong sense of betrayal. However, in the current situation, Mok Jong-un was the only one who could save them. Please, they desperately hoped it wasn't a lie. It shouldn't be difficult. With those words, Mok Jong-un was about to recite the oral formula. He considered deceiving them with an incomplete formula, as he had done with Mok Yuchen, but they were the rightful owners of that secret manual. If he tried to deceive them, his head might roll. As he was about to open his mouth, mortal, a familiar voice echoed in his mind. It was Chingryong. Mok Jong-un rolled his eyes and surveyed his surroundings. However, he couldn't see her anywhere. He was already puzzled by her absence when he had called for her earlier. "Look at the roof across from you." "Roof." At those words, he looked up at the roof. Chingryong was standing there. Why wasn't she coming closer? Could it be that she was keeping her distance out of wariness of this monster-like man and that diviner? It seemed to be the case. However, what is it? Chingryong's demeanor was somewhat different from usual. The crimson glow in her eyes as she stood on the roof was incredibly deep. No, it felt like a blazing flame. He could tell through their connected fate. Anger, the emotion he sensed from her, was immense anger. It was an intense anger that could drench this entire place in blood, but she was suppressing it with tremendous self-control. Why was she acting like this? As he wondered, Chingryong spoke. The moment you recite that oral formula, you will die. What? Was she trying to dissuade him out of concern for that? Of course, if he recited the entire formula, they could strike him from behind. It would be better to recite half of it and handle the rest in a different way. Mortal. Follow the oral formula and posture that I recite exactly. Mok Jong-un slightly furrowed his brow. What did she mean by following her oral formula and posture? They would know what was written inside, so if he recited a different formula, they would surely know it was wrong. However, don't overthink it and trust me for now. If you die, mortal, I will die too. At those words, Mok Jong-un pondered numerous thoughts in an instant. The moment the oral formula was wrong, his head would roll, but if he recited the formula she taught him. As he was contemplating, the bright blade king Sun Yun said, "Why aren't you doing it?" After deliberating, Mok Jong-un finally reached a conclusion. He then clenched his sword fingers, and he imitated Chen Gryong, who was assuming a bow stance on the roof with the moonlight at her back. From a distance, the postures of the two became identical. Chen Gryong opened her mouth. The source of non-existence, the order of the Tao. The eagle soars through the clouds, the hawk catches the hare. The sword descends like a falling leaf. Along with that, she slowly performed the first stance while extending her sword fingers forward. It was as if a beautiful woman was performing a sword dance. The phrase, "a beauty under the moon," came to mind. Her fluttering red robe swayed in sync with her stances, resembling scattered flower petals. It was a movement that naturally captivated the soul. If only the situation weren't like this, he would have loved to watch leisurely. Mok Jong-un then opened his mouth. The source of non-existence, the order of the Tao. The eagle soars through the clouds, the hawk catches the hare. The sword descends like a falling leaf. And he followed Chen Gryong's movements. Exactly as he had received them, he reproduced them without a single difference. Ache, ache, some untrained muscles cried out in pain, but he ignored it and focused on her every fingertip. Swish, 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 swish. At Mok Jong-un's sword technique, the bright blade king Sun Yun's eyes wavered. He wasn't the only one. Manner Master Mok In-dan also couldn't take his eyes off the first stance Mok Jong-un was demonstrating. How could this be? He couldn't help but be astonished. It was truly a peerless sword technique. Each stance was flawless, and it was difficult to find any defects. Since it was a secret manual guarded by the Heaven and Earth Society, he had expected it to be remarkable to a certain extent, but it was truly incredible. However, what was even more surprising was this child. How can he move like this? Mok Jong-un's current movements were not something a mere third-rate martial artist could achieve. Although he moved slowly without infusing internal energy, everything from his fingertips seemed as if a peerless swordsman who had reached the realm of the sword was demonstrating a sword dance. A swordsman of that level could clearly discern it. If he was like this, how could Sun Yun be any different? Sun Yun also couldn't hide his admiration at Mok Jong-un's display. Not only did he recognize and view the stances, but the swordplay he demonstrated was a movement that absolutely couldn't be achieved at that child's level. Is it talent? It was an incomprehensible talent. Based on his perception, he was at most a third-rate or barely second-rate level, yet he demonstrated the stances as if a peerless swordsman was performing for someone to see. It was at that moment. Murmur, murmur. The sound of stirring could be heard among the masked individuals. Sun Yun knew why they were reacting like that. The evil perishes under the heavenly light. Nothing can resist the Tao. The swordsman. Mok Jong-un was about to recite another oral formula and demonstrate the second stance. Oh no, he had to stop him. They couldn't let others hear any more of the stance's oral formulas. Sun Yun hurriedly shouted, "Enough!" Swish. Mok Jong-un, who had been extending his sword fingers diagonally, halted his movement, and he checked Sun Yun's reaction. He had been following Chen Gryong's movements on the roof with extreme concentration, so he hadn't noticed the reaction. Mok Jong-un was inwardly puzzled upon seeing the bright blade King Sun Yun's expression. This time, it was truly a gamble. After all, the oral formula wasn't the one written in the secret manual. However, judging by Sun Yun's expression, it didn't seem like he had made a mistake at all. If that weren't the case, they would have already beheaded him. Mok Jong-un asked, "Are you convinced now?" At this question, Sun Yun stared intently at Mok Jong-un without uttering a word. In his mind, an image of someone else demonstrating the same stances as Mok Jong-un was painted like a picture. It was utterly villainous. However, the sword technique Mok Jong-un had demonstrated was completely different in nature. If that was the case, without a doubt, it was definitely the secret manual. There was no room for doubt. Sun Yun tried his best to hide it, but his heart was pounding. Although it had turned out differently than expected, to think he would witness the sword formula of the moon lineage, Chinese letter, that was said to have been severed 100 years ago. It was hard to contain his excitement. However, Sun Yun quickly suppressed that emotion. Make sure to retrieve it. Retrieving the original secret manual was the best course of action. However, if what this fellow said was true, the original had already disappeared from the world. This fellow's mind was the only secret manual. Bright Blade King. At that moment, the voice of the middle-aged man with the eye patch, Diviner Joe, was heard. Although he didn't say anything else, judging by Diviner Joe's slight headshake, Sun Yun seemed to understand what he meant. He was probably telling him not to kill the kid. He must be tempted. It was intriguing for him as well. This brat had accomplished what no one in the society had been able to do. Most of them had lost their lives. If that was the case, either the cursed secret manual had chosen that child, or there was something special about him. But the secret manual must not be learned by anyone other than the permitted individual. Therefore, the right course of action was to extract the contents from his mind and kill him. However, it felt like a waste. Seeing his contemplative demeanor, Mok Jong-un's eyes narrowed. There's something. They were unaware of the true contents within the secret manual. However, judging by their reactions, they seemed convinced that the oral formula of the stances Chen Griong had taught him was the content inside. If that weren't the case, they would have already beheaded him. But that expression of considering something while looking at him, is he reconsidering? There was only one thing he could guess. Perhaps, since it was a secret manual precious enough for them to call it their treasure, it shouldn't be learned by outsiders. If that was the case, now that they had confirmed it was genuine, were they planning to extract it from his mind and then kill him? Mok Jong-un glanced at Diviner Joe. Judging by his reaction, he seemed to have considerable interest in him. In that case, considering you went through the trouble of coming all the way here to find the secret manual, it must be a valuable item, right? What? Swish. Mok Jong-un leaped towards a nearby warrior of the Yon Mok sword manner, and he practically snatched the sword from him. I'll borrow this for a moment. What? Mok Jong-un placed the sword he had snatched against his own neck and said, If I die, all your efforts in coming to find it will be in vain. At Mok Jong-un's words, one of the bright blade King Sun Yun's eyebrows rose. Was this brat trying to bargain with his own life? Sun Yun scoffed and said, Do you have the courage to take your own life while saying such things? In response to that question, Mok Jong-un smiled faintly. It's not particularly difficult. Stab, the blade of the sword pierced Mok Jong-un's neck. For a moment, Sun Yun was dumbfounded. He had naturally assumed that Mok Jong-un would try to bargain with his life to survive against him, but that bastard was now trying to behead himself without hesitation. Stop! Sun Yun shouted a reprimand infused with internal energy. Ugh! Erg! At the resounding sound that echoed, everyone momentarily covered their ears. Mok Jong-un also frowned and staggered from the pain and dizziness caused by the sound infused with internal energy, but he didn't let go of the sword piercing his neck. Despite the discomfort, he endured it. This bastard, Sun Yun then shouted, Stop! Swish! At those words, Mok Jong-un relaxed his strength and stopped pushing the sword into his neck. Blood flowed down his neck, staining his collar red. Sun Yun spoke in a dumbfounded tone, You're insane, you bastard. If it were anyone else, he would have scoffed at the brat's foolish actions, but this fellow was different. Not only his eyes, but also the way he didn't hesitate to take his own life, as if he had no attachment to it. It's hard to live in this world without being a little insane. You talk as if you've experienced the world, you young brat. What do you want? Tap, tap. Mok Jong-un tapped his forehead with his finger and said with a smile, "Now that you know how valuable the contents in my mind are, I have no intention of easily revealing them. So don't bother assessing this and that and take the secret manual nicely." "What? That diviner over there also wants that, doesn't he?" Sun Yun's expression turned peculiar. "Take it nicely. Is this bastard not asking to be spared in exchange for revealing the secret manual, but instead suggesting he will willingly follow them to their headquarters?" As Sun Yun was dumbfounded, a glint of interest flickered in his eyes. "Ha! Look at this bastard." Chapter 50. The Heaven and Earth Society 3. The bright blade King Sun Yun, who had been glaring at Mok Jong-un, burst into laughter and said, "Ha ha 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 ha! This one is quite the character." It had been a long time since he encountered such a brazen fellow. Even those who knew of his notoriety, whether outside or within the society, couldn't muster the audacity to behave in such a manner. No, it was hard to even consider it audacity. He's different. The Yon Mok sword manor was a renowned martial arts family. To think he would encounter such a lunatic-like fellow in a place that was no different from a righteous sect. For some reason, this brat seemed closer to their side than the other. That's why it was intriguing. After laughing for a while, Sun Yun shook his head and said, "A living secret manual willingly coming to our headquarters, there's no reason to refuse. Very well. I hope you don't regret those words." At his words, Lady Seok, the first wife, and the second son, Mok Yunpyong, couldn't hide their inner joy. The Heaven and Earth Society was known for its notoriety, so they had been worried about the worst-case scenario, but this was the best outcome. How wonderful was it that everything was resolved with that Mok Jong-un alone. However, Manor Master Mok In-dan felt differently. Clench. The hand gripping his sword tightened. This sense of powerlessness was a first for him. If he could, he wanted to shout at them to release Mok Jong-un immediately. Whether he liked him or not, he was his son. However, the situation was ambiguous. He had memorized the secret manual. When he first learned of that fact, he had been greatly surprised. That was because he, too, had tried various means to view the secret manual, but had been unable to even untie the prayer beads. Thus, he had naturally assumed that Mok Jong-un possessed the secret manual rather than having memorized it. Since he hadn't seen the secret manual in the first place, he thought there would be no problem if they just returned it. However, that had completely gone awry. Having memorized the secret manual, they will never let him go. If an outsider had secretly memorized the Yon Mok sword manor's secret manual, it was only natural to demand their life as punishment for that crime. That's how important a secret manual was to martial artists. Therefore, Mok Jong-un's judgment might be correct in this situation. It was the only way to stay alive, even if only slightly. "I'm sorry." As the manor master, he had no choice but to bear the responsibility for everyone's lives. If they fought to protect Mok Jong-un, they would surely be annihilated. That Sun Yun was a monster to that extent. Endure it for a while. Once they left, he planned to seek help from the Righteous Alliance. The Righteous Alliance was one of the three major factions in the current martial arts world, along with the Heaven and Earth Society. He had some high-level connections and friendships, so he was determined to retrieve his son by borrowing the power of the Righteous Alliance. However, an unexpected event occurred at this point. Swish! At that moment, Sun Yun's figure blurred and he suddenly appeared behind Mok Jong-un. Then, like a flash of lightning, he sealed his acupressure points. Pack, 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 pack. Mok Jong-un, whose acupressure points had been sealed, collapsed to the ground, losing consciousness. Sun Yun caught him with his hand and called out to a masked individual, "Take care of this fellow." At this, Manor Master Mok In-dan shouted, "What is the meaning of this? What is this? Even if he willingly came with us, did you think I would let him continue to bargain with his own life?" At Sun Yun's words, Mok In-dan gritted his teeth. As expected, he was not an easy opponent. Objectively speaking, it was a natural response. Well, putting that aside, now that we have retrieved the secret manual, shall we settle the remaining debt? Debt? Manor Master Mo, did you really think that after tampering with our society's item, you could simply return it and move on as if nothing happened? At those words, everyone in the Yon Mok Sword Manor who had been inwardly relieved tensed up again. They had a feeling that things wouldn't be resolved so easily. At that moment, Manor Master Mok-Dan assumed a bow stance and spoke. "Will you break your promise?" "Promise?" "That's right. If that child learns that you have broken your promise, do you think he will reveal the secret manual he has memorized?" "Ha ha ha ha, that's ridiculous. Will it matter whether you live or die?" The strong aura emanating from him. It was so powerful that the expressions of everyone in the Yon Mok Sword Manor darkened. "So you've finally come to this?" As he spoke, Manor Master Mok-Dan drew true energy from his danjian. It was a situation on the brink of explosion. The bright blade King Sun Yun aimed his Taoist sword at him, grinned, and said, "But since this elder is in a good mood today, I'll give you one last chance." "Chance? What do you mean?" "I'm saying I'll give you a way for the Yon Mok Sword Manor to survive. A way to survive." "That's right." At Sun Yun's words, Mok-Dan frowned and asked, "What is it?" "I'll give you two choices. If you refuse all of this, the Yon Mok Sword Manor will be annihilated tonight." "What are those choices?" For now, he decided to hear him out. If they fought, there was a 90% chance that the Yon Mok Sword Manor would be annihilated. "First, surrender to our Heaven and Earth Society and become a subordinate sect." At the bright blade King Sun Yun's words, the Yon Mok Sword Manor side stirred. That was because, although the Yon Mok Sword Manor was a renowned martial arts family that upheld righteousness, the Heaven and Earth Society was not. They walked their own path of villainy, neither righteous nor evil. Therefore, surrender was tantamount to abandoning their pride as righteous individuals. Grit. It was only natural for them to be furious to the point of stirring, even while fearing them. They would have preferred death, but they couldn't do that. "Even if it means dying, we will resist until the end. You have integrity." Sun Yun had naturally expected them to refuse the first proposal. "Then, for the second, seal your sect for 10 years and hand over your successor as a hostage." The moment they heard the second proposal, the entire Yon Mok Sword Manor fell silent. Manor Master Mok-Dan's expression was also grim. He had expected them to make a difficult proposal. That ominous premonition had been correct, sealing the sect won. It literally meant sealing off martial arts activities for 10 years. Typically, when a sect was defeated in a war between sects or when a sect fell, they would seal their sect. Sealing the sect, it was more realistic than the previous proposal. It was the only way to acknowledge defeat without compromising their last shred of dignity. However, during those 10 years, the Yon Mok Sword Manor would gradually weaken, unable to engage in external activities, and they would be unable to interact with other sects or anyone else. "If we seal the sect, our clan will decline." However, it was a better choice than everyone dying. As he was contemplating, someone approached him. "Father!" It was none other than the eldest son, Mok Yong-ho. The first son, known as a debauchee, had only brought disappointment to him by indulging in wine and women. For him to speak up at this crucial moment, Mok-Dan couldn't help but be puzzled. "What is it?" "They say to sleep on firewood and taste gall. Although it may be difficult, please accept this proposal." Sleeping on firewood and tasting gall too. It meant enduring humiliation and suffering for the sake of the future. At Mok Yong-ho's words, a glint of surprise flashed in Manor Master Mok-Dan's eyes. This kid, it wasn't his usual demeanor. He had thought he had lost his spirit by indulging in wine and women. However, looking at his eyes and expression now, he could see him barely restraining his shame. He seemed even angrier than himself. As he was inwardly puzzled, Mok Yong-ho said, "Please send me. As the eldest son of our clan, am I not the closest to being the successor?" "What?" He volunteered to go himself. Was this really the same child who had only brought disappointment by indulging in wine and women? As he was astonished, Mok Yong-ho whispered softly, "Fortunately, you haven't made that youngest child the successor yet." Manor Master Mok-Dan's eyes wavered. With those words, Mok-Dan understood Mok Yong-ho's true intentions for the first time. Mok-Dan's eyes reddened. "Ah, Yong-ho. Yong-ho. All this time you indulged in wine and women for that reason. Was it to yield the succession to the youngest, Yuchen? Was that why he had brought disappointment by indulging in wine and women? Mok-Dan clutched his chest, overwhelmed by shock. It pained his heart that he had only scolded this child without trying to understand his true feelings. He was so different from his mother. "Father, I apologize for causing you distress all this time. Please take care of your health." Mok Yong-ho politely bowed and turned to the bright blade King Sun Yun, speaking in a loud voice. "The Manor Master has accepted Hero Sun's second proposal. I, the eldest son and successor of the Yon Mok Sword Manor, will be the hostage." "No." At that moment, Sun Yun interrupted him. He then pointed at someone with his finger and said, "Where are you trying to deceive me? I will take that child." Oh no, the eldest son, Mok Yong-ho, bit his lip firmly. The one Sun Yun pointed to. It was the youngest, Mok Yuchen, whom he had been trying to protect by sacrificing himself. They had overlooked something. Unlike the righteous martial arts world, which prioritized the firstborn eldest son or the first accepted disciple in terms of respect, the Heaven and Earth Society strictly followed the law of the strong. Therefore, in their eyes, the successor of the Yon Mok Sword Manor was naturally Mok Yuchen, who possessed the most outstanding martial arts talent. Rattle, rattle. Inside the carriage there was a masked warrior and two people lying motionless, their eyes covered and bound. They were none other than Mok Jeong-un and Mok Yuchen. As hostages or prisoners, their treatment was not very good. They're thorough. Sigh, Mok Yuchen let out a sigh. Unlike Mok Jeong-un, his acupressure point for fainting hadn't been sealed, so he hadn't lost consciousness, but the acupressure points for paralysis and muteness had been sealed, rendering him unable to move. As if that wasn't enough, they had also blindfolded him and tied his entire body, arms and legs with thick ropes. They were meticulous in their precautions. How far have we gone? They seem to have traveled for about a few shichen. Although sunlight didn't enter the carriage, it must have been daylight. He had thought they would camp at some point since it was late at night, but they continued to move without rest. Hostage? Mok Yuchen had been reflecting on his predicament throughout the journey. When Manor Master Mok-Dan had awakened, he had been elated with hope that he might become the successor, but in an instant, he had become a hostage. Moreover, he was a hostage of the Heaven and Earth Society, the most dangerous group in the martial arts world. He had no choice. What will happen from now on? A hostage was no different from a prisoner. If it were a hostage exchange between groups of similar standing, he might expect good treatment, but it was difficult to expect that from the Heaven and Earth Society. Even now, he was treated less than human. Thud. As the carriage climbed a slope, someone's body naturally touched him, and he felt their weight pressing against him. Even though he couldn't move his body, his sense of touch hadn't disappeared. Mok Jeong-un. It was probably Mok Jeong-un. Was he in a better situation than this fellow for now? No, maybe it was better to be unconscious. At least in that moment, he was no different from being asleep without any worries. Right at that moment, the carriage came to a stop. Creak. The sound of the carriage's rear door opening was heard, and a soft voice spoke. "We'll rest here for a while, so go take care of any business you have." "Understood." Creak. With the sound of the door closing, the presence disappeared. It was hard to hear clearly, but it seemed they were taking a short break here. After all, they had been moving for half a day without rest. Even if they had cultivated martial arts, their stamina wasn't infinite. How long do I have to stay like this? As he was pondering at that very moment, swish, a very faint movement was felt beside him. What was that? Right now, only he and Mok Jeong-un were in this carriage as the masked guard had temporarily left. But who was moving? As he was wondering, he felt someone squirming behind his back. Could it be? It couldn't be. Not only had he been struck on his acupressure points, but his entire body was also restrained. Moreover, unlike himself, wasn't it that monster-like man, the Bright Blade King, who had personally sealed Mok Jeong-un's acupressure points? As he found it strange, someone lifted the cloth covering Mok Yuchen's eyes. What? Mok Yuchen's eyes widened. It was none other than Mok Jeong-un. How surprisingly, Mok Jeong-un was moving freely, and not only that, He had somehow untied the ropes that had been restraining him. How on earth did this fellow release the acupressure point ceiling?